Hey guys, tonight we begin with a mysterious outbreak that turned an entire city into an endless dance floor. A bizarre phenomenon that, by all accounts, should have come with warning labels. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's July 15, 18, and the summer heat hangs heavy over the cobblestone streets of Strasbourg, a prosperous city nestled in what is now eastern France, but was then part of the Holy Roman Empire. The morning mist rises from the Rhine River, and merchants are setting up their stalls in the busy marketplace. Life moves at its usual medieval pace, deliberate, predictable, governed by the rising and setting of the sun. But today would be different. Today would mark the beginning of one of the most extraordinary and inexplicable events in recorded history. An event so strange, so utterly bizarre, that even now, more than 500 years later, we're still trying to understand what really happened during those sweltering summer months in Strasbourg. Our story begins with a woman named Frau Troffa. History has preserved her name, though little else about her personal life remains. What we do know is that on this particular July morning, something compelled her to step into the narrow streets and begin dancing. Not the joyful, celebratory dancing you might expect at a festival or wedding, but something far more intense, far more desperate. She danced alone at first, her feet moving to music that only she could hear. Hour after hour, she continued, her movements growing more frantic, more exhausted, but never stopping. Neighbors gathered to watch, initially amused by what seemed like harmless eccentric behavior. But as the hours turned into a full day, and then another, their amusement turned to concern, and then to something approaching horror. Frau Troffa couldn't stop dancing. She didn't stop for food, for water, for rest. She danced through the scorching afternoon heat, through the cool of evening, through the darkness of night, and into the next dawn. Her feet became bloody, her body swayed with exhaustion, but still she danced. And then, something even stranger happened. Others began to join her. Chapter 1. The Contagion Spreads. Within a week of Frau Troffa's first steps, 34 other people had been seized by the same inexplicable compulsion to dance. Men, women, children. The affliction seemed to recognize no boundaries of age, gender, or social class. They came from different neighborhoods, different trades, different families, yet they all found themselves drawn to the streets, their bodies moving in the same relentless, exhausting rhythm. The dancing wasn't beautiful. It wasn't coordinated or graceful. Witnesses described it as wild, desperate, almost violent in its intensity. The dancers' faces were contorted with exhaustion and what appeared to be anguish. They sweated profusely, their clothes becoming soaked through. Their feet bled from the constant friction against the rough cobblestones. Yet they could not, would not stop. By the end of July, the number had grown to hundreds. The city of Strasbourg, with a population of roughly 20,000, watched in growing alarm as their neighbors, friends, and family members succumbed to what seemed like an epidemic of dance. The afflicted gathered in the city squares and wide streets, creating a horrifying spectacle of human bodies in constant, frenzied motion. Local chroniclers, those careful record-keepers of medieval life, documented the phenomenon with a mixture of fascination and terror. They wrote of dancers who appeared to be in a trance-like state, their eyes often closed or staring blankly ahead, seemingly unaware of their surroundings despite their continued movement. Some dancers spoke to invisible companions, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there. Others called out warnings about visions only they could see. The city's physicians were called in to examine the dancers, but they found themselves at a complete loss. The dancing plague defied every medical understanding of the time. The dancers showed signs of extreme physical exhaustion, rapid pulse, heavy breathing, profuse sweating, yet they possessed a supernatural endurance that seemed to defy human limitations. When forced to stop, even briefly, they became agitated and distressed, desperate to resume their movements. What made the situation even more bewildering was the apparent contagious nature of the affliction. People who had shown no previous signs of the dancing compulsion would suddenly, without warning, begin moving to the same unheard rhythm. Sometimes it happened gradually. A person might start with small, almost imperceptible movements, tapping their feet or swaying slightly, before being completely overtaken by the full dancing frenzy. Other times, the onset was immediate and dramatic, with individuals suddenly bursting into the wild, exhausting dance that characterized the plague. The summer heat of 1518 was particularly brutal that year, and the physical toll on the dancers was severe. With no rest, little food, and minimal water, their bodies began to break down under the constant strain. Yet still, they danced. Chapter 2: Medieval Strasbourg and its People. To understand the full impact of the dancing plague, we need to step back and examine the world in which it occurred. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city caught between worlds, geographically, politically, and culturally. Located on the Rhine River, it served as a crucial trading hub between northern and southern Europe, a place where German and French influences merged and sometimes clashed. The city was officially part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it enjoyed considerable autonomy as a free imperial city. This independence had allowed Strasbourg to develop its own unique character, one that embraced both trade and scholarship. The city was home to one of Europe's most beautiful Gothic cathedrals, a magnificent structure that dominated the skyline and served as both a spiritual center and a symbol of civic pride. But beneath this veneer of prosperity and sophistication, Strasbourg, like much of Europe in the early 16th century, was a place of considerable tension and uncertainty. The Protestant Reformation was gaining momentum, challenging centuries-old religious authority and creating deep divisions within communities. The printing press, invented just decades earlier, was spreading new ideas and new anxieties at an unprecedented pace. The economy, while generally strong due to the city's strategic location, was subject to the volatile fluctuations that characterized medieval trade. Harvests could fail, trade routes could be disrupted by war or political conflict, and prosperity could turn to hardship with alarming speed. For ordinary citizens, life was precarious in ways that are difficult for us to fully comprehend today. Medical knowledge in 1518 was still largely based on ancient theories that bore little resemblance to modern understanding. The human body was thought to be governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and illness was believed to result from imbalances between these substances. Treatments often involved bloodletting, purging, or attempts to restore humoral balance through diet and lifestyle changes. Mental illness was even more poorly understood. Conditions that we might now recognize as depression, anxiety, or psychosis were often attributed to supernatural causes, possession by demons, divine punishment for sin, or the influence of malevolent spirits. The boundary between the physical and the spiritual was far more porous than it would later become, and unusual behavior was often interpreted through a religious lens. This was also an era of intense superstition and folk belief. People believed in the power of curses, the influence of astrological events, and the possibility of supernatural intervention in daily life. Unusual phenomena were often seen as omens or signs of divine displeasure. In this context, the dancing plague would have been deeply terrifying not just because of its physical manifestation, but because of what it might represent in spiritual terms. The social structure of Strasbourg was rigidly hierarchical, as was typical of medieval cities. At the top were the wealthy merchants and guild masters who controlled much of the city's economic life. Below them were skilled craftsmen, shopkeepers, and other middle-class citizens. At the bottom of the social ladder were laborers, servants, and the poor, who lived precarious lives with little security or hope of advancement. Women in 1518, Strasbourg had limited rights and opportunities. They could not vote, hold political office, or practice most professions. Their lives were largely defined by their relationships to men, as daughters, wives, or widows. Yet women were not entirely powerless. Some, particularly widows, could inherit and run businesses. Others found influence through religious institutions or informal networks of female relationships. It's worth noting that Frau Trotha, the woman who began the dancing plague, was identified by the title Frau, indicating that she was married. This small detail tells us something about her social status. She was not a young unmarried woman or a servant, but an established member of the community. Her sudden descent into uncontrollable dancing would have been all the more shocking because it represented a complete break from expected social behavior. Chapter 3. The authorities respond. As the dancing plague spread through Strasbourg, the city's authorities found themselves facing a crisis unlike anything in their experience. The usual tools of medieval governance, laws, punishments, civic ordinances, seemed utterly inadequate to address a phenomenon that defied rational explanation. The city council, composed of wealthy merchants and guild representatives, initially approached the problem with the practical mindset that had served them well in managing trade disputes and maintaining civic order. Their first instinct was to seek medical expertise. They consulted with the city's physicians, hoping that learned men with knowledge of ancient texts and medical theory could provide both explanation and cure. The physicians, trained in the medical traditions inherited from ancient Greece and Rome, examined the dancers and applied their understanding of humoral theory. They concluded that the dancing was caused by hot blood, an excess of the sanguine humor that was making the blood too warm and causing it to heat the brain. This diagnosis seemed to make sense within the medical framework of the time. Excessive heat could certainly explain frenzied behavior. Based on this diagnosis, the physicians recommended what seemed like a logical treatment: more dancing. Their reasoning was that allowing the hot blood to be expended through continued movement would eventually restore the body's natural balance. The excess heat would literally be danced away, bringing the sufferers back to a state of humoral equilibrium. Acting on this medical advice, the city council made a decision that would prove to be catastrophic. They decided to encourage the dancing rather than try to stop it. They hired professional musicians to play for the afflicted, providing them with rhythmic accompaniment for their movements. They constructed wooden stages in public spaces where the dancers could perform more safely, away from the rough cobblestones that were tearing their feet to shreds. The council also hired professional dancers, hoping that skilled performers could somehow guide or channel the chaotic movements of the afflicted into more structured, less harmful patterns. These professional dancers were instructed to dance alongside the plague victims, perhaps hoping that their expertise would somehow transfer to the sufferers, or that their presence would provide a calming influence. This response reveals something fascinating about medieval thinking. Rather than seeing the dancing as inherently pathological, the authorities initially viewed it as a natural phenomenon that needed to be managed rather than eliminated. Their approach was pragmatic. If people must dance, then let them dance safely and in an organized manner. The results of this policy were disastrous. Rather than expending the hot blood and returning to normal, the dancers became even more frenzied. The music seemed to intensify their movements rather than provide relief. More concerning still, the public nature of the city-sponsored dancing appeared to encourage new cases. People who had previously shown no signs of the affliction began to succumb, drawn perhaps by the spectacle or infected by whatever mysterious force was driving the phenomenon. The wooden stages became theaters of human suffering. Witnesses described scenes of indescribable chaos and anguish. Dancers collapsed from exhaustion, only to be helped back to their feet by city officials who believed that continued movement was necessary for their cure. The professional musicians played increasingly frantic tunes, trying to match the tempo of the afflicted, creating a hellish symphony that echoed through the streets of Strasbourg. As the situation worsened, the city council began to reconsider their approach. Reports started reaching them of dancers dying from exhaustion, heart failure, or stroke. The policy of encouraging the dancing was not only failing to cure the affliction, it appeared to be making it worse and potentially deadly. The council found themselves in an impossible position. The medical authorities had given them a treatment plan based on the best knowledge available, but that treatment was clearly not working. The dancing plague had moved beyond a medical curiosity to become a genuine public health crisis that threatened the stability and reputation of the entire city. Rumors were beginning to spread to other cities and regions. Merchants traveling through Strasbourg carried tales of the dancing plague with them, threatening the city's reputation as a stable, well-governed trading center. In an era when a city's economic survival depended on its reputation for order and reliability, the dancing plague represented more than just a local health problem. It was an existential threat to Strasbourg's prosperity. The council began to consider alternative explanations and treatments. If medical science had failed, perhaps the answer lay elsewhere. Some members suggested that the dancing might be a spiritual rather than a physical affliction, requiring religious intervention rather than medical treatment. Chapter 4: Religious Interpretations and Interventions. As the medical approach to the dancing plague proved not only ineffective but potentially harmful, the people of Strasbourg began to seek explanations and solutions from their spiritual authorities. In 1518, the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was far more permeable than it would later become, and many citizens were already inclined to view the dancing plague through a religious lens. The Catholic Church, still the dominant religious authority in Strasbourg despite growing Protestant influence, initially approached the phenomenon with caution. Church officials were well aware that unusual behaviors and apparent mass afflictions could be interpreted in multiple ways, as divine punishment for sin, as demonic possession, as tests of faith, or even as miraculous interventions. Local priests and monks began visiting the dancers, observing their behavior and attempting to discern spiritual signs that might reveal the true nature of their affliction. What they found was deeply troubling. Many of the dancers appeared to be in states that resembled religious ecstasy, but with disturbing differences. While mystics and saints were known to experience transcendent states that could involve unusual physical manifestations, the dancing plague victims seemed to be suffering rather than experiencing divine bliss. Some observers reported that the dancers called out the names of saints, particularly Saint Vitus, who was associated with dancing and epilepsy in medieval tradition. Saint Vitus was believed to have the power both to inflict and to cure dancing afflictions, making him a natural focus for both fears and hopes regarding the plague. The invocation of his name by the dancers suggested to some that this might indeed be a supernatural phenomenon rather than a purely medical one. Other dancers were heard speaking in what sounded like foreign languages or making utterances that seemed to contain prophetic or visionary content. In an era when divine revelations were taken seriously, these vocalizations were carefully documented and analyzed by church authorities. Some priests believed they were hearing authentic spiritual messages, while others suspected demonic influence. The question of demonic possession was particularly troubling for church authorities. If the dancers were indeed possessed by evil spirits, it would require immediate and aggressive intervention through exorcism and other spiritual remedies. However, the sheer number of afflicted individuals made this explanation problematic. Could dozens or hundreds of people simultaneously become possessed? While not impossible within medieval theological understanding, it would suggest a level of demonic activity that was deeply alarming. An alternative interpretation began to gain support among religious authorities. The dancing plague might be a form of divine punishment visited upon the city for its collective sins. This explanation had the advantage of accounting for the widespread nature of the affliction, while also suggesting a clear path toward resolution. If the dancing was indeed divine punishment, then the appropriate response would be communal repentance, prayer, and acts of religious devotion. This interpretation gained particular traction when religious authorities began examining the moral state of Strasbourg in the months and years leading up to the plague. They noted several concerning trends: increasing wealth inequality, growing influence of Protestant ideas that challenged traditional authority, and what they perceived as a general decline in religious observance and moral behavior. The city had experienced significant social tensions in recent years. The growing prosperity of merchant families had created a wider gap between rich and poor. Protestant preachers had been gaining followers with their criticisms of church wealth and corruption. There had been several incidents of public disorder and challenges to traditional authority. In this context, the dancing plague could be seen as a divine warning or punishment for the city's moral failings. Based on this interpretation, religious authorities recommended a dramatically different approach to treating the plague. Instead of encouraging more dancing, they proposed that the city should focus on spiritual remedies, communal prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, and acts of charity and penance. The most significant religious intervention came in the form of a pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Vitus. Since many of the dancers had been heard invoking his name, religious authorities reasoned that the saint might hold the key to ending the plague. A formal pilgrimage was organized, with the afflicted dancers being transported to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, located in a nearby town. The pilgrimage itself was a major undertaking. The dancers, many of whom were severely weakened by their continuous movement, had to be carried or supported for the journey. Special carts were constructed to transport those who could no longer walk. The entire procession became a public spectacle, drawing crowds of observers from throughout the region. At the shrine, elaborate religious ceremonies were conducted. Masses were said for the dancers, holy relics were displayed, and prayers were offered for their recovery. The dancers were blessed with holy water and encouraged to pray directly to Saint Vitus for relief from their affliction. Some were even bound with blessed ropes or chains, both as a form of restraint and as a spiritual intervention designed to break whatever supernatural force was compelling their movement. The results of the pilgrimage were mixed but encouraging. Some dancers did appear to recover during or immediately after the religious ceremonies. They stopped their frenzied movement, appeared to regain awareness of their surroundings, and showed signs of returning to normal behavior. These recoveries were hailed as miraculous interventions by Saint Vitus and used as evidence supporting the spiritual interpretation of the plague. However, not all dancers were cured by the pilgrimage. Some continued their compulsive movement even in the presence of holy relics and during religious ceremonies. Others appeared to recover temporarily, only to relapse into dancing when they returned to Strasbourg. These partial or failed recoveries complicated the religious interpretation and suggested that the phenomenon might be more complex than a simple case of divine punishment or saintly intervention. Chapter 5. The Social Impact. While medical authorities debated humoral imbalances and religious leaders sought spiritual explanations, the dancing plague was having profound effects on the daily life and social fabric of Strasbourg. The sight of hundreds of people dancing uncontrollably in the streets created an atmosphere of fear, confusion, and social disruption that touched every aspect of community life. Families were torn apart by the plague in ways that went beyond the obvious trauma of seeing loved ones afflicted. When a family member became a dancer, it created immediate practical problems. Who would tend to their work, their children, their household responsibilities? The medieval economy depended heavily on family labor, and the sudden loss of even one family member to the dancing plague could create serious economic hardship. The situation was particularly difficult for families of modest means. Wealthy families could hire servants or rely on extended family networks to maintain their households when someone became afflicted. Poor families had no such resources. When a breadwinner became a dancer, their family might face immediate destitution. When a mother became afflicted, her children might be left without adequate care. The emotional toll was equally severe. Families watched helplessly as their loved ones danced themselves toward exhaustion and potential death. The dancers often seemed to be in their own world, unresponsive to pleas from family members to stop, rest, or take food and water. This created a particularly cruel form of grief. The afflicted person was physically present, but emotionally and mentally absent. The contagious nature of the phenomenon added another layer of fear. Families lived in constant anxiety that other members might suddenly be seized by the dancing compulsion. Children were kept away from areas where dancers congregated, but this provided only limited protection since new cases could appear anywhere, anytime without warning. The economic impact on Strasbourg was substantial. The city's prosperity depended on trade, and trade required an atmosphere of stability and normalcy. Merchants from other cities were reluctant to visit a place that seemed to be under some kind of supernatural curse. Those who did come often completed their business as quickly as possible and left, unwilling to risk exposure to whatever force was causing the dancing plague. Local businesses suffered as well. Shops and workshops in areas where dancers congregated were often forced to close or relocate. The constant presence of exhausted, often distressed dancers made normal commercial activity difficult or impossible. The sounds of the plague, the stomping feet, the labored breathing, the occasional cries or utterances from the dancers, created an atmosphere that was hardly conducive to business. The city's tourism, centered around its magnificent cathedral and its reputation as a center of learning and culture, virtually disappeared. Pilgrims and travelers who might normally have visited Strasbourg stayed away, unwilling to enter a city that seemed to be experiencing some form of divine displeasure or supernatural affliction. The dancing plague also had significant effects on Strasbourg's political and social hierarchy. The city's elite, who prided themselves on their ability to maintain order and govern effectively, found their authority challenged by a phenomenon they could neither understand nor control. The failure of their initial medical approach, followed by the mixed results of religious intervention, undermined confidence in traditional forms of authority. Some members of the working classes began to interpret the dancing plague as a sign of divine displeasure with the existing social order. If God was punishing the city, perhaps it was because of the growing inequality and the neglect of the poor by the wealthy elite. This interpretation was particularly appealing to those who were already attracted to Protestant ideas about the corruption of traditional authority. The social tensions created by these competing interpretations sometimes erupted into open conflict. There were reports of heated arguments between supporters of different explanations for the plague. Some citizens blamed the wealthy for bringing divine punishment on the city through their greed and excess. Others blamed the poor for their supposed moral failings. Still others blamed religious reformers for challenging traditional church authority and thereby opening the community to supernatural attack. The dancing plague also had effects on gender relations within Strasbourg society. A significant number of the dancers were women, which led to various theories about the particular susceptibility of the female sex to this type of affliction. Medieval medical theory generally held that women were more emotionally volatile and physically weaker than men, making them more prone to certain types of disorders. However, the presence of male dancers complicated simple gender-based explanations. Men were also succumbing to the plague, though possibly in smaller numbers. This gender pattern would later become important for historians and medical researchers trying to understand the phenomenon, but at the time it simply added to the general confusion about the nature and causes of the affliction. The role of women in responding to the plague was also significant. Women often served as primary caregivers for afflicted family members, trying to provide food, water, and comfort to dancers who seemed largely unaware of their surroundings. Women also played important roles in the religious responses to the plague, participating in prayer groups, organizing charitable activities, and supporting the pilgrimage to St. Vitus's shrine. Chapter 6. The Spread of Fear and Rumors. As summer progressed and the dancing plague showed no signs of abating, Strasbourg became a city consumed by fear and wild speculation. The failure of both medical and religious authorities to provide definitive explanations or effective treatments created a vacuum that was quickly filled by rumors, conspiracy theories, and increasingly desperate attempts to find someone or something to blame. Word of the dancing plague spread throughout the Holy Roman Empire and beyond with the speed that only truly extraordinary news can achieve. Merchants, travelers, and pilgrims carried tales of the dancing city to every corner of Europe. With each retelling, the stories became more elaborate and more frightening. Some accounts described thousands of dancers rather than hundreds. Others claimed that the dancers had supernatural strength or that they spoke in tongues and prophesied the end of the world. These exaggerated accounts had serious consequences for Strasbourg's reputation and economic well-being. Cities that had previously enjoyed regular trade relationships with Strasbourg began to restrict or prohibit contact with merchants from the afflicted city. Some regions imposed formal quarantine measures, treating the dancing plague as if it were a conventional infectious disease that could be transmitted through contact with goods or people from Strasbourg. The fear of contagion was not entirely irrational. While the dancing plague was clearly not spreading like a typical infectious disease, it wasn't following normal patterns of person-to-person transmission. Its apparent ability to suddenly seize previously healthy individuals was genuinely terrifying. No one could explain why some people became dancers while others remained unaffected, and this uncertainty made everyone feel potentially vulnerable. Within Strasbourg itself, the search for explanations became increasingly desperate and often took on a sinister character. When rational explanations failed, people began looking for scapegoats, individuals or groups who could be blamed for bringing this curse upon the city. Jews, who formed a small but visible minority in Strasbourg, became frequent targets of suspicion and blame. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories suggested that Jewish residents had somehow caused the dancing plague through magical practices, or had poisoned the city's water supply with substances that induced dancing mania. These accusations were not new. Jewish communities throughout Europe had long been blamed for various disasters and unexplained phenomena, but the dancing plague provided a fresh focus for ancient prejudices. The accusations against the Jewish community were particularly dangerous because they came at a time when Strasbourg's authorities were feeling vulnerable and desperate for solutions. While city leaders did not officially endorse anti-Semitic theories, they also did not strongly oppose them, creating an atmosphere in which violence against Jewish residents became a real possibility. Other scapegoats included foreign merchants, wandering performers, and anyone else who seemed somehow different or outside the traditional community structure. Traveling musicians were viewed with particular suspicion, since music seemed to intensify the dancer's affliction. Some performers were expelled from the city or forbidden from playing their instruments in public spaces. Women who were suspected of practicing witchcraft or folk magic also came under scrutiny. Medieval society had long been suspicious of women who possessed knowledge of herbs, healing practices, or other activities that could be interpreted as supernatural. The dancing plague provided a new context for these old fears, and several women were accused of using magic to cause or spread the affliction. The religious tensions that were already present in Strasbourg were amplified by the dancing plague. Protestant reformers saw the plague as evidence of God's displeasure with Catholic corruption and called for more radical religious reforms. Catholics viewed Protestant challenges to traditional authority as the cause of divine punishment and demanded a return to orthodox practices and beliefs. These competing religious interpretations sometimes led to heated public confrontations. Protestant preachers held outdoor sermons blaming the plague on Catholic idolatry and clerical corruption. Catholic priests responded with sermons of their own, condemning Protestant heresy as the source of the city's troubles. Both sides organized prayer meetings and religious processions, creating a kind of spiritual competition that added to the general atmosphere of tension and anxiety. The failure of authorities to end the plague also led to the emergence of various folk remedies and alternative treatments. Desperate families were willing to try almost anything that offered hope of curing their afflicted loved ones. These remedies ranged from relatively harmless herbal treatments to more dangerous practices involving bloodletting, purging, or attempted physical restraint of the dancers. Some of these alternative approaches were based on folk beliefs about the supernatural causes of dancing afflictions. Certain herbs were believed to ward off evil spirits or break magical spells. Holy objects, such as blessed metals or pieces of saints' relics, were worn as protective amulets. Specific prayers or incantations were recited in hopes of driving away whatever force was compelling the dancing. The desperation that drove people to try these remedies also made them vulnerable to exploitation by charlatans and con artists. Individuals claiming to possess special knowledge or magical powers began arriving in Strasbourg, offering expensive treatments or protective services. Some sold worthless potions or amulets at high prices to frightened families. Others claimed to be able to identify the supernatural causes of the plague or to predict who would be afflicted next. The proliferation of these alternative explanations and treatments created additional chaos and confusion. Instead of a unified community response to the crisis, Strasbourg found itself fragmented into competing factions, each with its own theory about the cause of the plague and its own preferred solution. Chapter 7: Theories about the cause. As the dancing plague continued through the summer of 1518, scholars, physicians, and educated observers throughout Europe began developing theories to explain this unprecedented phenomenon. These theories reflected the intellectual frameworks and cultural assumptions of the early 16th century, blending medical knowledge, religious belief, and folk understanding in ways that seemed strange to modern observers, but made perfect sense within their historical context. The medical establishment's initial explanation centered on the theory of humoral imbalance, specifically an excess of hot, dry humors that heated the blood and affected the brain. This explanation was consistent with established medical doctrine and provided a rational framework for understanding the dancer's behavior. According to this theory, certain individuals possessed constitutions that made them particularly susceptible to humoral imbalances, which explained why some people became dancers while others remained unaffected. Physicians elaborated on this basic humoral theory by suggesting specific triggers that might have caused the imbalance. The unusually hot summer weather of 1518 was frequently cited as a contributing factor. Heat was believed to naturally increase the hot humors in the body, potentially pushing susceptible individuals past the threshold into pathological dancing. This explanation had the advantage of accounting for the timing of the outbreak. It began during the hottest part of the summer and seemed to intensify during particularly warm periods. Dietary factors were also considered. Some physicians theorized that certain foods, particularly those classified as hot in medieval dietary theory, might have contributed to the humoral imbalance. Spicy foods, alcoholic beverages, and even certain types of bread made from specific grains were suspected of potentially triggering or worsening the dancing affliction. This led to recommendations for dietary changes among the general population as a preventive measure. Astrological explanations represented another important category of medical thinking. In 1518, astrology was considered a legitimate branch of medical science, and many physicians routinely considered celestial influences when diagnosing and treating diseases. Several astrological factors were identified as potentially relevant to the dancing plague. The position of the planets, particularly Mars and Venus, was carefully analyzed. Mars was associated with heat and violence, while Venus was connected to music and dancing. Some astrologers suggested that a particular planetary conjunction had created celestial conditions that were conducive to dancing afflictions. The fact that the plague had begun in July, during a specific arrangement of celestial bodies, was seen as supporting evidence for astrological causation. The phases of the moon were also considered significant. Some observers noted that the dancing seemed to intensify during certain lunar phases, particularly the full moon. This observation fit well with established beliefs about lunar influences on human behavior and bodily functions. Medieval medical theory held that the moon affected the body's fluids, including blood and other humors, so lunar causation of a blood-related disorder seemed entirely plausible. Religious explanations for the dancing plague were equally diverse and sophisticated. The interpretation of the plague as divine punishment remained popular throughout the summer, but religious thinkers developed increasingly complex theories about the specific nature of the sins being punished and the spiritual mechanisms involved. Some theologians focused on individual sin, suggesting that each dancer was being punished for personal moral failings. This interpretation implied that the dancing would continue until each afflicted individual achieved genuine repentance and spiritual purification. It also suggested that the plague might serve as a kind of spiritual test or purification process, ultimately beneficial for the souls of those who endured it. Other religious authorities emphasized collective sin and communal responsibility. They argued that the entire city of Strasbourg was being punished for allowing moral corruption to flourish within its boundaries. This interpretation suggested that ending the plague would require not just individual repentance, but collective action to address the community's spiritual problems. A more specific religious theory focused on violations of holy days and religious observances. Some clerics noted that the dancing plague had begun during a period when various religious festivals and saints' days were being observed. They suggested that improper celebration of these holy occasions, either through excessive revelry or insufficient devotion, might have triggered divine displeasure. The role of Saint Vitus in the plague attracted particular theological attention. Saint Vitus was known as both a protector against dancing afflictions and a saint who could inflict such afflictions as punishment. Some theologians developed complex theories about why Saint Vitus might have chosen to afflict Strasbourg and what forms of devotion or penance might be required to appease him. Demonic explanations represented a darker category of religious thinking. While full demonic possession seemed unlikely given the large number of afflicted individuals, some authorities suggested forms of demonic influence that fell short of complete possession. These theories proposed that evil spirits were somehow inspiring or compelling the dancing without taking complete control of the dancers' souls. These demonic theories often incorporated elements of folk belief about malevolent magic and supernatural interference in human affairs. Some suggested that the demons had been summoned or directed by human agents, witches, sorcerers, or practitioners of forbidden magical arts. This explanation had the advantage of providing human targets for blame and punishment, which appealed to authorities who were desperate for actionable solutions. Folk explanations for the dancing plague drew on centuries of popular beliefs about supernatural causes of illness and unusual behavior. Many of these explanations centered on the concept of cursed or enchanted locations. Some residents of Strasbourg became convinced that certain areas of the city had become supernaturally tainted, causing anyone who entered them to be seized by the dancing compulsion. The idea of cursed ground led to various theories about what might have caused the supernatural contamination. Some suggested that the sites had been polluted by unholy activities, perhaps secret gatherings of witches or sorcerers, or violations of sacred space. Others proposed that the contamination was the result of natural phenomena, such as underground vapors or celestial influences that affected specific geographical locations. Another category of folk explanation involved the concept of dancing spirits, supernatural entities that possessed a particular affinity for music and movement. According to these theories, the spirits had somehow been attracted to Strasbourg and were compelling residents to dance as a form of entertainment or worship. These spirits were generally conceived as mischievous rather than evil, which suggested that they might be appeased or distracted rather than driven away through violent exorcism. The variety and sophistication of these competing theories reflected the intellectual vitality of early 16th century Europe, but it also contributed to the confusion and paralysis that characterized the official response to the plague. With so many plausible explanations available, it was difficult for authorities to choose a single course of action or to maintain public confidence in any particular approach. Chapter 8: Attempts at Treatment and Control. The multiplicity of theories about the dancing plague's causes led to an equally diverse array of attempted treatments and control measures. As the summer of 1518 progressed and the plague showed no signs of natural resolution, the desperation of authorities and citizens alike drove them to try increasingly varied and sometimes contradictory approaches to ending the crisis. The initial medical strategy of encouraging more dancing had been quickly abandoned after it became clear that music and organized dancing were making the situation worse rather than better. Physicians then shifted to more traditional medical interventions based on humoral theory. Since the dancing was attributed to overheated blood, treatments focused on cooling the body and restoring humoral balance. Bloodletting became a common treatment for afflicted dancers. Physicians made small incisions in the dancers' arms or applied leeches to draw out what they believed was excess hot blood. The theory was that removing some of the superheated blood would reduce the humoral imbalance driving the compulsive dancing. In practice, bloodletting often weakened the dancers further without stopping their movement, creating a dangerous cycle of increasing debilitation. Purging treatments were also widely employed. Dancers were given strong laxatives and emetics designed to expel corrupt humors through the digestive system. These treatments were based on the idea that the dancing affliction was caused by toxic substances in the body that needed to be eliminated. Like bloodletting, purging often made the dancer's physical condition worse without addressing their compulsive movement. Dietary interventions represented a more subtle form of medical treatment. Physicians prescribed specific foods thought to have cooling properties that might counteract the hot humors causing the dancing. Cold, moist foods like cucumber, lettuce, and certain fruits were recommended, while hot, dry foods like spices and aged cheeses were forbidden. Patients were also encouraged to drink large quantities of water and other cooling beverages. The challenge with dietary treatments was that many dancers showed little interest in food or drink, being completely absorbed in their compulsive movement. Family members and medical attendants often had to force-feed dancers or wait for brief moments of exhaustion when they might accept small amounts of nourishment. Pharmaceutical treatments of the era included various herbal preparations thought to have calming or cooling effects. Poppy extracts, which contained natural opiates, were sometimes used to try to sedate dancers and break the cycle of compulsive movement. Valerian, chamomile, and other herbs with mild sedative properties were also employed. However, these treatments faced the same fundamental problem as dietary interventions. It was extremely difficult to administer them to people who were in constant motion. Physical restraint emerged as another category of attempted treatment, though it was controversial and often counterproductive. Some physicians and family members attempted to tie down dancers or confine them in small spaces, hoping that forced immobility would break the cycle of compulsive movement. These attempts usually resulted in extreme distress for the dancers, who became agitated and struggled violently against their restraints. More sophisticated forms of physical intervention involved attempts to exhaust the dancers in controlled ways. Some attendants tried to encourage dancers to move in less harmful patterns, guiding them away from rough surfaces that were injuring their feet or helping them maintain balance to prevent falls. Others attempted to provide periods of supported rest, holding dancers upright while their legs continued to move but their bodies were prevented from falling. The religious approaches to treatment were equally varied and reflected different theological interpretations of the plague's spiritual significance. Prayer and religious ritual became central to many treatment efforts, with family members and clergy conducting almost continuous religious observances around the dancers. Exorcism was attempted in cases where demonic influence was suspected. These rituals involved formal prayers, the display of holy relics, and the use of blessed water and sacred oils. Some exorcisms were conducted individually for specific dancers, while others involved group ceremonies designed to drive evil influences away from entire areas of the city. The pilgrimage to St. Vitus's shrine represented the most ambitious religious intervention. The organization of this pilgrimage required enormous resources and coordination. Special transportation had to be arranged for dancers who could no longer walk normally. Provisions were needed for what could be a multi-day journey. Religious ceremonies had to be planned and coordinated with the shrine's clergy. The pilgrimage itself became a form of public spectacle that attracted attention from throughout the region. The sight of dozens of exhausted dancers being transported to seek divine intervention created a powerful image of human desperation and divine mystery. For many observers, the pilgrimage represented either the height of religious devotion or a disturbing example of superstitious thinking, depending on their own theological perspectives. When some dancers appeared to recover during or after the pilgrimage, it provided strong support for religious interpretations of the plague. However, the fact that not all dancers were cured, and that some who initially recovered later relapsed, complicated the religious narrative and suggested that the phenomenon might be more complex than simple divine punishment or saintly intervention. Folk remedies and magical interventions represented another category of attempted treatments, often practiced alongside or in competition with official medical and religious approaches. These remedies drew on centuries of popular belief about supernatural causes of illness and the power of various objects, rituals, and substances to counteract malevolent influences. Protective amulets became popular among both dancers and their families. These included blessed medals, pieces of saints' relics, and various objects thought to have protective properties. Some families hired cunning folk or wise women who claimed special knowledge of how to break supernatural spells or ward off evil influences. Herbal treatments based on folk knowledge sometimes differed significantly from those prescribed by trained physicians. While doctors focused on cooling herbs based on humoral theory, folk practitioners might use plants associated with specific saints or believed to have protective properties against supernatural attack. Some of these folk remedies involved complex rituals of preparation and administration that were as important as the herbs themselves. The use of blessed objects and holy water became widespread, not just as religious interventions but as practical attempts to create barriers against whatever force was causing the dancing. Families sprinkled holy water around their homes, wore blessed objects, and carried religious artifacts as protection against the spread of the affliction. Some folk treatments involved attempts to transfer or redirect the dancing compulsion. These practices were based on the idea that the supernatural force causing the dancing could be moved from human victims to other objects or locations. Rituals involving the burial of personal objects belonging to dancers, the use of substitution dolls, or the performance of specific dances designed to appease or satisfy the spirits were all attempted. The practical challenges of treating dancers created additional problems that went beyond the question of which theoretical approach was correct. Dancers were often unresponsive to their surroundings, making it difficult to communicate with them or gain their cooperation in treatment efforts. They frequently showed signs of exhaustion and dehydration, but seemed unable or unwilling to rest or take nourishment. The physical deterioration of the dancers created urgent medical needs that had to be addressed regardless of the underlying cause of their condition. Feet became severely injured from constant contact with rough surfaces. Bodies became weakened from lack of food and rest. Some dancers developed what appeared to be heat exhaustion or other conditions related to prolonged physical exertion. These immediate physical problems required practical solutions that could be implemented even when the fundamental cause of the dancing remained mysterious. Soft materials were placed on the ground where dancers congregated to reduce injuries to their feet. Attempts were made to provide water and liquid nutrition in ways that dancing patients could consume. Shelters were erected to protect dancers from sun and rain. The coordination of these various treatment efforts became a significant challenge for city authorities. Different approaches sometimes conflicted with each other, and families often wanted to try multiple treatments simultaneously. The city had to manage not only the direct effects of the dancing plague, but also the chaos created by numerous competing attempts to address it. Resource allocation became a serious problem as the summer progressed. The city was spending significant money on medical consultations, religious ceremonies, and practical support for the dancers and their families. At the same time, the economic disruption caused by the plague was reducing the city's revenue and ability to fund these efforts. The failure of early treatment attempts created a crisis of confidence that extended beyond the immediate medical and religious authorities. Citizens began to question not just specific treatments, but the competence and authority of their leaders more generally. This erosion of trust made it more difficult to organize coordinated responses and led to increased reliance on individual family initiatives and folk remedies. Chapter 9. The Plague's Peak and Gradual Decline. By August 1518, the dancing plague had reached what appeared to be its peak intensity. Contemporary chronicles suggest that at its height, the phenomenon may have affected as many as 400 people, though exact numbers are difficult to verify due to the chaos and incomplete record-keeping of the time. The city of Strasbourg had become a place of almost constant motion, with groups of dancers moving through the streets at all hours of the day and night. The sheer scale of the phenomenon at its peak created logistical challenges that strained the city's resources and administrative capacity. Large areas of the city center had to be effectively abandoned to the dancers, as normal commercial and social activities became impossible in spaces dominated by people in constant frenzied movement. The sounds of the plague, the rhythmic stamping of feet, the labored breathing of exhausted dancers, and the occasional cries or utterances, created an acoustic environment that was deeply unsettling for residents who remained unaffected. The visual impact of the plague at its peak was equally disturbing. Witnesses described scenes of hundreds of people moving in uncoordinated patterns, their clothes soaked with sweat, their faces showing signs of extreme exhaustion and distress. Many dancers had bleeding feet from the constant friction against stone surfaces. Some had lost significant weight from their inability to eat regular meals. Others showed signs of dehydration and heat exhaustion from their continuous physical exertion during the hot summer weather. Despite the horrific spectacle, there was something oddly mesmerizing about the mass dancing that drew crowds of observers from both within the city and from surrounding regions. People traveled considerable distances to witness what many considered to be an unprecedented supernatural or medical phenomenon. These spectators added to the chaos while also serving as potential witnesses who could spread accounts of the plague to other parts of Europe. The constant presence of observers created additional complications for city authorities. Some visitors came seeking to understand or document the phenomenon, while others arrived hoping to profit from the situation by selling supposed remedies or protective devices. Still others seemed drawn by morbid curiosity or the hope of witnessing miraculous interventions or supernatural events. The peak period of the plague also saw the emergence of what might be called secondary effects, problems that arose not directly from the dancing itself, but from the social and economic disruption it caused. Families of dancers faced severe financial hardship as breadwinners became unable to work. Children were sometimes left without adequate care when parents became afflicted. The elderly and infirm suffered from the general breakdown of normal community support systems. Crime rates appears to have increased during this period, as normal law enforcement became difficult in areas dominated by dancers and as some people took advantage of the general chaos. Theft, fraud, and various forms of exploitation became more common, adding to the overall sense of social breakdown and disorder. The religious life of the city was profoundly affected during the peak period. Normal church services became difficult or impossible in some areas due to the disruption caused by dancers. Some churches were actually invaded by afflicted individuals who danced down the aisles during religious ceremonies. This created theological dilemmas about whether the dancers should be welcomed as potentially holy individuals or expelled as disruptive influences. The failure of the initial pilgrimage to St. Vitus to cure all the dancers led to additional religious experiments. Some clergy organized special masses and prayer vigils specifically for the afflicted. Others attempted to recreate the conditions that had seemed to help some dancers recover during the pilgrimage, bringing relics and holy objects directly to the dancers rather than transporting the dancers to distant shrines. These varied religious interventions met with mixed success. Some dancers did appear to recover during or after specific religious ceremonies, but the recoveries were often temporary or partial. More troubling from a theological perspective was the fact that the dancers seemed largely unresponsive to religious interventions while they were actively dancing. They appeared to be in their own world, cut off from normal social and spiritual relationships. As August progressed, careful observers began to notice subtle changes in the pattern and intensity of the dancing plague. While new cases continued to appear, the rate of new infections seemed to be slowing. Some of the earliest dancers began showing signs of modification in their behavior, dancing less intensely, responding more to their surroundings, or taking brief periods of rest. These early signs of improvement were initially greeted with caution, as previous apparent recoveries had often been followed by relapses. However, as the pattern continued and expanded to include more dancers, hope began to grow that the plague might be entering a phase of natural decline. The reasons for this apparent improvement remained as mysterious as the original cause of the plague. Some observers attributed it to the cumulative effect of religious interventions, suggesting that the prayers and pilgrimages were finally achieving divine favor. Others proposed that the dancers were simply becoming too exhausted to continue their compulsive movement, reaching a physical limit that broke the cycle of the affliction. Medical authorities suggested that changing weather conditions might be responsible. As summer began to transition toward autumn, the extreme heat that had characterized July and early August began to moderate. If the dancing had indeed been caused by overheated humors, as medical theory suggested, then cooler weather might naturally restore humoral balance and allow recovery. The gradual nature of the improvement created both hope and continued anxiety. Families of dancers watched closely for signs that their loved ones might be recovering, but they also lived in fear that apparent improvements might prove temporary. The unpredictable pattern of recovery, some dancers improving while others continued unchanged, made it difficult to predict the course of the plague or to plan for the future. City authorities found themselves in the difficult position of trying to manage a crisis that seemed to be slowly resolving while still being unpredictable and potentially dangerous. They had to continue providing support for active dancers while also beginning to plan for the rehabilitation of those who were recovering and the restoration of normal civic life. The economic impact of the plague during this peak period was severe and long-lasting. Many businesses have been forced to close or relocate during the height of the dancing. Trade relationships have been disrupted by the city's reputation as a place under supernatural curse. The costs of caring for dancers and organizing treatment efforts had strained the city's finances. Recovery would require not just the end of the dancing itself, but also the restoration of confidence in Strasbourg as a stable, well-governed city suitable for trade and normal social interaction. This process would take months or years rather than weeks, making the economic consequences of the plague far more enduring than its immediate medical effects. The social fabric of the city had also been severely strained during the peak period. Trust in traditional authorities had been undermined by their inability to explain or effectively treat the plague. Religious and social divisions had been exacerbated by competing explanations for the phenomenon. Families and communities have been traumatized by watching loved ones suffer through an inexplicable and apparently untreatable condition. As the dancing began to show signs of decline, these social wounds would require healing just as much as the physical injury sustained by the dancers themselves. The community would need to find ways to make sense of what had happened and to rebuild the trust and cooperation necessary for normal civic life. Chapter 10. Recovery and Aftermath. As September arrived in 1518, the dancing plague that had terrorized Strasbourg for over 2 months began its slow, uneven retreat. The recovery process was as mysterious and unpredictable as the original outbreak had been, with dancers gradually returning to normal awareness and behavior in patterns that defied easy explanation or prediction. The first clear signs of widespread recovery came in early September, when observers noted that many dancers were beginning to respond to their surroundings in ways they had not done for weeks. Dancers who had previously seemed completely absorbed in their compulsive movement began to acknowledge the presence of family members, to show signs of hunger and thirst, and to demonstrate awareness of their physical condition and surroundings. The transition from dancing to recovery was rarely immediate or complete. Most dancers went through a gradual process that might last days or weeks. They would dance for shorter periods, take longer breaks, or modify their movements to be less intense and exhausting. Some would dance normally during the day but rest at night, reversing the pattern of constant movement that had characterized the peak period of the plague. Family members and medical attendants learned to recognize these early signs of recovery and to provide appropriate support during the transition period. Dancers who were beginning to recover needed careful reintroduction to food and water, as their digestive systems had often been severely disrupted by weeks of inadequate nutrition. They also required treatment for the various injuries and health problems that had accumulated during their time as active dancers. The physical rehabilitation of recovering dancers was a significant challenge. Many had sustained serious injuries to their feet and legs from constant movement on rough surfaces. Others showed signs of severe malnutrition, dehydration, and exhaustion. Some had developed what appeared to be lasting neurological effects, including difficulty with coordination, memory problems, or persistent tremors. Medical care during the recovery period drew on more conventional approaches than the exotic treatments that had been attempted during the active phase of the plague. Physicians focused on treating specific injuries and health problems rather than trying to address the mysterious cause of the dancing itself. This practical approach proved much more successful than the theoretical treatments based on humoral theory that had been attempted earlier. The psychological aspects of recovery were equally important and often more difficult to address. Many dancers emerged from their affliction with little or no memory of their time as dancers. They might remember the beginning of their compulsive movement but have no clear recollection of the weeks or months that followed. This amnesia was both a blessing and a curse. It spared them the trauma of fully remembering their ordeal, but it also made it difficult for them to understand what had happened to them and their community. Other recovering dancers retained vivid memories of their experience, but struggled to make sense of what they had gone through. Some described feeling as though they had been observers of their own bodies, aware of what was happening but unable to control their movements. Others reported experiencing visions, hearing voices, or feeling the presence of supernatural forces during their dancing period. These varied subjective experiences of the plague added another layer of complexity to attempts to understand what had really happened in Strasbourg. The fact that different dancers remembered their experience differently suggested that the phenomenon might have affected people in multiple ways, or that individual psychological factors played important roles in how the affliction manifested and resolved. The religious interpretation of the recovery process became a source of continued debate and division within the community. Those who had attributed the plague to divine punishment saw the gradual recovery as evidence that their prayers and penitential activities had been effective. They argued that God's anger had been appeased through the community's religious responses, and that the end of the plague demonstrated the power of faith and proper religious observance. However, the incomplete and uneven nature of the recovery complicated this religious narrative. If the plague had indeed been divine punishment, why had some dancers recovered while others continued to be afflicted? Why had the recovery been gradual rather than immediate and complete? These questions led to further theological speculation about the specific nature of divine justice and the possibility that some individuals required longer periods of spiritual purification. The medical establishment also claimed credit for the recovery, arguing that their treatments had gradually restored humoral balance and allowed the dancers' bodies to return to normal function. They pointed to the timing of the recovery, which coincided with cooler autumn weather that would naturally help to cool overheated humors, as evidence supporting their theoretical framework. Folk explanations for the recovery were equally varied. Some attributed it to the cumulative effect of various protective rituals and magical interventions that had gradually weakened whatever supernatural force was causing the dancing. Others suggested that the spirits or demons responsible for the plague had simply become bored or satisfied and moved on to other activities or locations. The economic recovery of Strasbourg proved to be a much longer and more difficult process than the medical recovery of individual dancers. The city's reputation had been severely damaged by the dancing plague, and it would take years to rebuild the trust and confidence necessary for normal trade relationships. Many merchants and trading partners remained suspicious of Strasbourg, unwilling to risk exposure to whatever force had caused the plague or concerned that the phenomenon might return. The city government found itself facing significant financial challenges as a result of the plague. The costs of caring for dancers, organizing treatment efforts, and managing the crisis had been substantial. At the same time, tax revenues had declined due to the disruption of normal economic activity and the departure or avoidance of traders and visitors. Rebuilding the city's economy required deliberate efforts to restore confidence and demonstrate that Strasbourg had returned to normal. City authorities organized public ceremonies and festivals designed to show that the dancing plague was truly over. They also implemented new health and safety measures intended to prevent similar outbreaks in the future, though these measures were based more on reassuring the public than on any clear understanding of what had actually caused the original plague. The social recovery of the community was perhaps the most complex and long-lasting aspect of the aftermath. The dancing plague had created deep divisions within Strasbourg society, pitting different groups against each other as they competed to explain the phenomenon and assign blame for its occurrence. These social tensions did not disappear when the dancing ended. Religious divisions between Catholics and emerging Protestant communities had been exacerbated by the plague, as each group blamed the other for bringing divine punishment on the city. These tensions would continue to simmer and would later contribute to Strasbourg's eventual conversion to Protestantism during the broader European Reformation. Class tensions had also been intensified by the plague, as working-class citizens questioned whether the city's elite had adequately protected and cared for ordinary residents during the crisis. Some argued that the wealthy had received better medical care and protection while the poor had been left to suffer. These grievances would influence local politics for years to come. The treatment of minority groups, particularly the Jewish community, had suffered during the plague as they became targets of blame and suspicion. Rebuilding trust and restoring normal relationships would require deliberate efforts to counter the prejudices and conspiracy theories that had flourished during the crisis. Perhaps most significantly, the dancing plague had fundamentally altered how the people of Strasbourg understood their world and their place within it. The failure of traditional authorities, medical, religious, and civic, to explain or effectively treat the phenomenon had shaken confidence in established knowledge and institutions. This crisis of authority would have lasting effects on how citizens related to their leaders and how they understood the nature of truth and knowledge. The documentation and memory of the dancing plague became important concerns as the immediate crisis passed. City officials wanted to preserve accurate records of what had happened, both for their own understanding and to provide accounts for other cities that might face similar phenomena. However, they also wanted to avoid creating records that might damage the city's reputation or perpetuate fears about Strasbourg's stability. The result was a somewhat sanitized official account that downplayed the more disturbing aspects of the plague while emphasizing the effectiveness of the authorities' response. These official records would later become important sources for historians trying to understand the phenomenon, but they had to be read carefully to account for their political and social motivations. As autumn settled over Strasbourg in 1518, the immediate crisis of the dancing plague had passed, but its effects would ripple through the community for years to come. The dancers had largely recovered, the streets had returned to normal, and the rhythms of daily life had resumed. Yet beneath this surface normalcy, fundamental questions remained unanswered. What had really caused hundreds of people to dance themselves to the point of exhaustion and even death? Why had it happened in Strasbourg at that particular time? Could it happen again? And perhaps most troubling of all, what did the failure of medieval authorities to understand or control the phenomenon say about the reliability of human knowledge and the stability of social order? The dancing plague of 1518 represents more than just a medical curiosity or historical oddity. It reveals the fault lines and tensions that existed beneath the surface of early 16th century European society. It shows us how communities responded to crisis, how different groups competed to define reality, and how ordinary people coped with experiences that defied conventional explanation. The story we follow tonight, the outbreak, the failed treatments, the social chaos, and the gradual recovery, is only the beginning of a larger narrative about human nature, social psychology, and the mysterious ways in which individual minds can sometimes connect across the boundaries that normally separate us. In our next journey together, we'll explore what modern science has revealed about mass psychogenic illness, examine other historical outbreaks of dancing manias and similar phenomena, and delve into the psychological and social mechanisms that can transform individual distress into collective behavior. We'll discover that the dancing plague of Strasbourg was not unique. Similar events have occurred throughout history and continue to occur today, offering us insights into the hidden connections between mind and body, individual and society, past and present. The mystery of what happened in those streets 5 centuries ago is far from solved, but the search for answers has led us to a deeper understanding of human nature itself. Sometimes the most important questions are not those that can be easily answered, but those that force us to examine our assumptions about what it means to be human, to live in community, and to search for meaning in a world that often seems to dance to rhythms we cannot hear or understand. Sleep well, and dream of simpler times when the only dancing was done by choice, to music that everyone could hear, in celebration rather than desperation. We'll return to this story soon, to explore what 5 centuries of investigation and research have taught us about one of history's most perplexing and haunting mysteries. Until then, rest easy in the knowledge that whatever forces drove those medieval dancers through the streets of Strasbourg, they have long since moved on, leaving us only with the questions, the stories, and the eternal human need to understand the inexplicable. When we left our story last time, the dancers of Strasbourg had gradually returned to their normal lives, leaving behind only questions, trauma, and the lingering mystery of what had really happened during those sweltering summer months of 1518. The medieval explanations, overheated blood, divine punishment, demonic influence, had proven inadequate to fully explain or effectively treat the phenomenon. But the story of the dancing plague doesn't end with the recovery of those original dancers. In many ways, that's where the real investigation begins. Over the centuries that followed, as medical knowledge advanced and our understanding of human psychology deepened, the dancing plague of Strasbourg became a case study that helped unlock secrets about the human mind and the mysterious ways in which individual consciousness can merge into collective behavior. Tonight, we'll explore what 500 years of scientific inquiry have revealed about that summer of madness in medieval Strasbourg. We'll discover that the dancing plague was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of human behavior that continues to this day. We'll examine other outbreaks of dancing mania throughout history, investigate the psychological mechanisms that can transform personal distress into group hysteria, and consider what these phenomena tell us about the hidden connections between mind and body, individual and society. The answers we found are both more complex and more fascinating than anything those medieval physicians could have imagined. They reveal aspects of human nature that are simultaneously disturbing and beautiful, showing us how the same psychological mechanisms that can create chaos and suffering can also generate art, religion, and the deepest forms of human connection. Chapter 1: The Scientific Revolution and New Understanding. For nearly 3 centuries after the dancing plague ended, the events in Strasbourg remained a curiosity mentioned in historical chronicles, but not seriously investigated by scholars or physicians. The medieval explanations, humoral imbalances, divine punishment, supernatural influence, continued to be accepted as adequate, if not entirely satisfying, accounts of what had happened. This began to change during the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, as European thinkers developed new approaches to understanding natural phenomena. The scientific revolution brought with it a commitment to empirical observation, systematic investigation, and natural rather than supernatural explanations for unusual events. Scholars began to look back at historical anomalies like the dancing plague with fresh eyes, seeking rational explanations based on emerging knowledge of human anatomy, physiology, and behavior. One of the first systematic attempts to understand the dancing plague from a modern scientific perspective came from the German physician Paracelsus in the 16th century. Though he lived close to the time of the original outbreak, Paracelsus represented a new type of medical thinking that emphasized direct observation and chemical explanations rather than the classical humoral theory that had dominated medieval medicine. Paracelsus proposed that the dancing plague had been caused by the imagination, not imagination in the modern sense of fantasy or creativity, but a specific medical concept referring to the power of mental states to create physical symptoms. According to his theory, the initial dancer had fallen into a state of intense mental disturbance that somehow communicated itself to others through observation and sympathy, creating a chain reaction of psychological and physical symptoms. This was a revolutionary idea for its time because it suggested that purely mental phenomena could create real, observable physical effects. It also implied that diseases could spread through psychological rather than physical contagion, an idea that wouldn't be fully developed until centuries later, but that represented an important step away from supernatural explanations. The 18th century brought more sophisticated attempts to understand mass phenomena like the dancing plague. Physicians and natural philosophers began to study what they called sympathetic diseases, conditions that seemed to spread through emotional or psychological rather than physical contact. They observed similar phenomena in religious revivals, where individual experiences of spiritual ecstasy could spread through entire congregations, and in cases of mass fainting or convulsions in schools and convents. The French physician Franz Anton Mesmer made important contributions to this emerging understanding through his work with what he called animal magnetism, the theory that invisible magnetic forces could influence human behavior and health. While Mesmer's specific theories about magnetic fluids were later discredited, his work demonstrated that mental states could indeed create dramatic physical symptoms, and that these effects could be transmitted from one person to another through suggestion and expectation. Mesmer's public demonstrations of hypnosis and magnetic healing often produced scenes reminiscent of the dancing plague, groups of people falling into trance-like states, exhibiting unusual behaviors, and experiencing physical symptoms that had no apparent medical cause. These controlled experiments provided the first clear evidence that phenomena like the dancing plague could be reproduced and studied under scientific conditions. The 19th century brought even more sophisticated approaches to understanding mass psychological phenomena. The development of neurology as a medical specialty provided new insights into how the brain and nervous system could malfunction in ways that produced unusual behaviors. Physicians began to recognize that many symptoms previously attributed to supernatural causes were actually neurological or psychological in origin. The French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot made particularly important contributions to this understanding through his work at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. Charcot studied patients with hysteria, a condition characterized by dramatic physical symptoms that seem to have no organic cause. He demonstrated that hysteria could produce an enormous range of symptoms: paralysis, convulsions, sensory disturbances, and unusual movements that could closely resemble the behaviors described in historical accounts of dancing plagues. Charcot's work was revolutionary because it showed that the mind could create symptoms that were both real and dramatic, but that didn't correspond to any identifiable physical disease. His patients weren't faking their symptoms. They were genuinely experiencing paralysis, pain, or other problems, but the source of these symptoms was psychological rather than organic. Perhaps most importantly for understanding the dancing plague, Charcot demonstrated that hysteria could be contagious in institutional settings. When one patient developed dramatic symptoms, others in the same ward might develop similar problems. This provided the first clear scientific evidence for the kind of psychological contagion that might have driven the spread of dancing mania in medieval Strasbourg. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the emergence of social psychology as a distinct field of study, bringing new tools for understanding group behavior and mass phenomena. Scholars like Gustave Le Bon wrote influential works on crowd psychology, exploring how individual behavior could be transformed when people gathered in groups. Le Bon argued that crowds had a kind of collective mind that could override individual judgment and create behaviors that no single person would exhibit alone. These insights from social psychology provided a framework for understanding how the dancing plague could have spread so rapidly through Strasbourg. According to this view, the dancers weren't simply imitating each other's behavior, they were experiencing a genuine alteration of consciousness that occurred when individual minds merged into a collective psychological state. The development of modern psychiatry in the early 20th century brought additional tools for understanding the dancing plague. Psychiatrists began to recognize that many unusual behaviors previously attributed to physical diseases or supernatural causes were actually symptoms of mental health conditions that could be studied and treated using psychological methods. Sigmund Freud's work on the unconscious mind provided new ways of thinking about how psychological conflicts and traumas could manifest as physical symptoms. While Freud himself didn't write extensively about mass phenomena like dancing plagues, his theories about conversion symptoms, psychological problems that expressed themselves as physical ailments, offered important insights into how mental distress could create the kind of dramatic behavioral changes seen in Strasbourg. Carl Jung's work on collective unconscious added another dimension to understanding mass psychological phenomena. Jung proposed that all humans shared certain psychological patterns and symbols that could become activated during times of stress or social upheaval. From this perspective, the dancing plague might have represented the activation of ancient psychological patterns related to ritual, trance, and collective behavior that lay dormant in normal times but could emerge during periods of social tension. Chapter 2: mass psychogenic illness in the modern era. As the 20th century progressed, medical researchers began to identify and study contemporary outbreaks of mass psychogenic illness, the modern scientific term for phenomena like the dancing plague. These studies provided unprecedented opportunities to observe, document, and analyze mass psychological contagion as it happened, offering insights that could be applied retrospectively to understand historical events like the Strasbourg outbreak. One of the most important characteristics that emerged from these modern studies was the remarkable consistency of mass psychogenic illness across different times, cultures, and social contexts. Whether occurring in medieval Europe, industrial-era factories, or modern schools, these outbreaks followed similar patterns and exhibited similar features, suggesting that they represented a fundamental aspect of human psychology rather than historically specific phenomena. The typical mass psychogenic illness begins with one or a few individuals who develop unusual symptoms, often dramatic physical manifestations like fainting, convulsions, paralysis, or unusual movements. These initial cases usually occur during periods of high stress or social tension, and they often affect individuals who are already experiencing personal difficulties or psychological strain. The key feature that distinguishes mass psychogenic illness from ordinary disease outbreaks is the mechanism of transmission. Instead of spreading through germs, contaminated food, or environmental toxins, these conditions spread through psychological processes, observation, suggestion, anxiety, and social influence. People who witness the initial cases may develop similar symptoms, often without any direct physical contact with the original sufferers. The speed of transmission in mass psychogenic illness can be remarkably rapid, much faster than would be possible with conventional infectious diseases. Symptoms can spread through a group in hours or days, creating the appearance of a sudden epidemic. This rapid spread often creates panic and confusion, as observers struggle to identify the apparent source of contagion. Modern outbreaks have been documented in a wide variety of settings, each offering insights into the social and psychological conditions that favor the development of mass psychogenic illness. Schools have been particularly common sites for these phenomena, with outbreaks affecting students in dozens of countries around the world. In 1962, a girls' boarding school in Tanzania experienced an outbreak of uncontrollable laughter that spread to affect over 1,000 students across multiple schools. The laughter episodes could last for hours and were accompanied by crying, screaming, and fainting. The outbreak was so disruptive that several schools had to be temporarily closed. Investigation revealed no physical cause for the symptoms, but researchers noted high levels of stress among students related to academic pressure and cultural conflicts between traditional and modern ways of life. A similar outbreak occurred in 1983 in the West Bank, where nearly 1,000 Palestinian schoolgirls developed symptoms including fainting, nausea, and difficulty breathing. Initial fears focused on possible chemical weapons or poison gas attacks, but extensive medical investigation found no evidence of toxic exposure. The outbreak coincided with a period of intense political tension and violence in the region, and researchers concluded that psychological stress rather than physical toxins was responsible for the symptoms. Factory settings have also been frequent sites of mass psychogenic illness, particularly during periods of labor disputes or economic uncertainty. In 1979, workers at a textile factory in South Carolina began experiencing symptoms including nausea, dizziness, and difficulty breathing. Health authorities initially suspected chemical contamination, but extensive testing revealed no toxic substances. The outbreak occurred during a time of rumors about layoffs and plant closure, and symptoms spread most rapidly among workers who were most anxious about job security. These modern cases share several important characteristics with the medieval dancing plague. They typically occur during periods of social stress or uncertainty. They affect groups of people who are in close social contact with each other. The symptoms are real and distressing for those who experience them, but they don't correspond to any identifiable physical disease, and they spread through psychological rather than physical mechanisms. The symptoms of mass psychogenic illness can vary widely depending on cultural context and social expectations. In some cases, people experience fainting or convulsions. In others, they might develop paralysis, sensory disturbances, or unusual movements. The specific symptoms often reflect the fears and anxieties that are prevalent in the affected community at the time of the outbreak. This cultural specificity helps explain why the dancing plague took the particular form it did in 16th century Strasbourg. Dancing was a meaningful activity in medieval culture, associated with both celebration and religious expression, but also with supernatural forces and divine judgment. In a time and place where people believed that supernatural powers could compel human behavior, compulsive dancing represented a culturally coherent way for psychological distress to manifest itself. Modern researchers have identified several factors that increase the likelihood of mass psychogenic illness outbreaks. High levels of stress or anxiety in the affected population are almost always present. Close social bonds between potential victims facilitate the spread of symptoms through emotional contagion. Ambiguous or threatening environmental conditions create uncertainty that can be filled by psychological explanations. And the presence of influential individuals who model symptom behavior can serve as catalysts for wider spread. The role of suggestion and expectation in mass psychogenic illness has been demonstrated through careful study of how symptoms spread through affected groups. People who are more suggestible or who have stronger beliefs in the reality of the supposed threat are more likely to develop symptoms. Information about the symptoms of earlier victims can influence the specific manifestations experienced by later cases. And the social status and credibility of initial victims can affect how widely their condition spreads to others. Media coverage and official responses can significantly influence the course of mass psychogenic illness outbreaks. Sensationalized reporting that emphasizes mysterious or threatening aspects of the phenomenon can increase anxiety and facilitate symptom spread. Conversely, calm, factual communication that provides reassurance and explanation can help contain outbreaks. The actions of authorities, whether they respond with panic or measured investigation, can either amplify or reduce the psychological factors that drive these phenomena. Treatment approaches for mass psychogenic illness have evolved significantly from the medieval responses to the dancing plague. Modern interventions focus on reducing anxiety, providing reassurance, and removing affected individuals from the environment where symptoms developed. Separating victims from each other can help break the cycle of psychological contagion, while providing clear, factual information about the nature of their condition can reduce fear and facilitate recovery. The prognosis for mass psychogenic illness is generally good, with most victims recovering completely once the outbreak subsides and normal social conditions are restored. However, some individuals may experience lasting psychological effects, particularly if they were stigmatized or traumatized by their experience during the outbreak. Understanding mass psychogenic illness has important implications for public health and emergency response. These phenomena can create genuine medical emergencies, even though their causes are psychological rather than physical. Victims experience real symptoms that require medical attention, and the social disruption caused by outbreaks can have significant economic and psychological costs for affected communities. Perhaps most importantly, studying mass psychogenic illness reveals something fundamental about human nature and the ways in which individual psychology is embedded in social relationships. These phenomena show us that the boundary between individual and group psychology is more permeable than we often assume, and that our mental and physical well-being is intimately connected to the psychological state of the communities in which we live. Chapter 3. Other Historical Dancing Manias. The dancing plague of Strasbourg in 1518 was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of similar outbreaks that occurred throughout medieval and early modern Europe. By examining these other dancing manias, we can better understand both the specific conditions that contributed to the Strasbourg outbreak and the broader psychological and social mechanisms that underlie mass psychogenic phenomena. The earliest well-documented dancing mania occurred in 1021 in the German town of Kolbig, though this event had a somewhat different character from later outbreaks. According to contemporary chronicles, a group of peasants began dancing in the churchyard during Christmas Eve Mass, disrupting the religious service. The local priests cursed them to dance continuously for a full year as punishment for their sacrilege. The Kolbik incident illustrates the complex relationship between dancing, religion, and social control in medieval Europe. While later accounts would emphasize the involuntary and pathological nature of dancing manias, the Kolbik case began as a deliberate act of disruption that was then transformed into a supernatural punishment. This suggests that the line between voluntary and involuntary dancing was often blurred in medieval consciousness, and that religious and social authorities played important roles in defining which types of dancing were acceptable and which were pathological. A more typical dancing mania outbreak occurred in 1237 in the town of Erfurt, also in Germany. This outbreak began with children, who started dancing in the streets and were soon joined by adults. The dancing continued for several hours and spread to involve hundreds of people before gradually subsiding. Unlike the Kolbik incident, the Erfurt outbreak was generally viewed as a medical or supernatural affliction, rather than a form of social rebellion. The 14th century saw several significant dancing mania outbreaks, possibly related to the social and psychological trauma caused by the Black Death and its aftermath. In 1374, a major outbreak began in Aachen and spread along the Rhine River, affecting communities in what is now Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. This outbreak was particularly notable for its geographic scope and its association with pilgrimage routes and religious festivals. The 1374 outbreak exhibited many of the same features that would later characterize the Strasbourg plague. Dancers moved in groups through the streets, seemed to be in trance-like states, and appeared unable to stop their movement voluntarily. Contemporary observers noted that the dancers called upon saints, particularly Saint John the Baptist and Saint Vitus, and that some appeared to have visions or religious experiences during their dancing episodes. The religious dimension of the 1374 outbreak was particularly pronounced. Many of the dancers were pilgrims who had been traveling to religious shrines, and the outbreak spread primarily along established pilgrimage routes. This suggests that the intensive religious atmosphere of medieval pilgrimage, with its emphasis on spiritual transformation, physical hardship, and collective experience, may have created psychological conditions that were conducive to mass hysteria. The association between dancing manias and religious pilgrimage appears in several other historical outbreaks. In many cases, groups of pilgrims would begin dancing uncontrollably during their journey or upon reaching their destination. The physical exhaustion, emotional intensity, and social bonding that characterized medieval pilgrimage may have lowered psychological barriers and made participants more susceptible to collective psychological states. The 15th century saw continued outbreaks of dancing mania, often associated with times of social stress or religious upheaval. In 1428, a dancing outbreak occurred in the monastery of Schöntal in Germany, affecting the nuns and disrupting the religious life of the community. This monastic outbreak illustrates how the enclosed, intense social environment of religious communities could facilitate the spread of mass psychological phenomena. Monastic outbreaks of unusual behavior were relatively common throughout medieval Europe, often taking forms other than dancing. Nuns might develop collective symptoms such as barking like dogs, meowing like cats, or speaking in tongues. These phenomena were usually interpreted as either divine inspiration or demonic possession, depending on the theological perspective of the observers. The most famous non-dancing monastic outbreak occurred in the French convent of Laudon in the 17th century, where nuns claimed to be possessed by demons and exhibited dramatic behaviors including convulsions, contortions, and speaking in foreign languages. While this outbreak didn't involve dancing, it shared many psychological features with dancing manias and demonstrated how religious communities could become sites of collective psychological phenomena. The geographical distribution of dancing mania outbreaks reveals interesting patterns about the social and cultural conditions that favored these phenomena. Most documented outbreaks occurred in German-speaking regions of Central Europe, with fewer cases reported in France, Italy, or other parts of the continent. This geographic clustering suggests that specific cultural factors in Germanic societies may have made dancing manias more likely to be recorded and remembered. One possible explanation for this geographic pattern relates to religious and social tensions that were particularly acute in German-speaking regions during the late medieval and early modern periods. These areas were sites of intense religious conflict, including early Protestant movements, peasant rebellions, and struggles between secular and religious authorities. The psychological stress created by these conflicts may have created conditions that favored the development of mass psychogenic phenomena. The timing of dancing mania outbreaks also reveals important patterns. Many occurred during summer months, when hot weather might have contributed to physical and psychological stress. Others coincided with religious festivals or pilgrimage seasons, when large numbers of people gathered in emotionally charged environments. Some outbreaks occurred during times of economic hardship, political upheaval, or epidemic disease, when communities were already experiencing high levels of anxiety and social disruption. The specific symptoms and behaviors exhibited during dancing manias show both consistency and variation across different outbreaks. The core symptom, compulsive, exhausting dancing that the affected individual seemed unable to control, appeared in virtually all cases. However, the style of dancing, the duration of episodes, and the associated behaviors varied considerably. Some outbreaks involved relatively structured, rhythmic dancing that resembled folk dances or religious rituals. Others featured more chaotic, frenzied movement that appeared random and uncoordinated. Some dancers sang, chanted, or called out while they moved, while others remained silent. Some appeared to be in ecstatic or trance-like states, while others seemed distressed or frightened by their condition. These variations in symptom presentation reflect the influence of cultural expectations and social context on the manifestation of psychological distress. The specific form that a dancing mania took was shaped by the prevailing beliefs, fears, and social patterns of the community in which it occurred. This cultural specificity helps explain why dancing manias were particularly common in medieval Europe, but are rarely seen in modern mass psychogenic illness outbreaks. The responses of authorities to dancing mania outbreaks evolved over time, reflecting changing medical and religious understanding. Early outbreaks were often interpreted purely in religious terms, as either divine punishment or demonic influence. Treatment focused on prayer, exorcism, and other spiritual interventions. As medical knowledge advanced, authorities began to incorporate natural explanations alongside supernatural ones. The humoral theory that dominated medieval medicine provided a framework for understanding dancing manias as medical conditions, even if the specific treatments based on this theory were generally ineffective. By the early modern period, some authorities were beginning to recognize the psychological and social dimensions of dancing manias. They noted the contagious nature of these outbreaks and the importance of social factors in their spread. This growing understanding led to more sophisticated response strategies that focused on separating affected individuals, controlling crowds, and managing public information about the outbreaks. The decline of dancing mania outbreaks in the 16th and 17th centuries coincided with broader changes in European society and culture. The Protestant Reformation altered religious practices and beliefs in ways that may have reduced the likelihood of religiously inspired mass hysteria. The growth of centralized state authority provided more effective mechanisms for managing social disorder. And the early development of modern medical and scientific thinking began to provide alternative frameworks for understanding unusual psychological phenomena. However, the underlying psychological mechanisms that produced dancing manias did not disappear. They simply found new forms of expression that were more consistent with changing cultural expectations and social conditions. The mass psychogenic illness outbreaks that continue to occur in modern times represent the same fundamental human tendencies toward collective psychological behavior, adapted to contemporary social and cultural contexts. Chapter 4. The Psychology of Collective Behavior. To truly understand the dancing plague of Strasbourg and similar historical phenomena, we must delve into the psychological mechanisms that allow individual minds to merge into collective behavior. The field of social psychology has revealed that human consciousness is far more malleable and socially influenced than we often realize, and that under certain conditions, the boundary between individual and group psychology can become remarkably permeable. One of the fundamental insights from modern psychology is that much of what we consider to be individual, autonomous behavior is actually heavily influenced by social factors that operate below the level of conscious awareness. We unconsciously mirror the postures, expressions, and movements of people around us. We adjust our opinions and perceptions to match those of our social groups. We experience emotions that are triggered not by our own direct experiences, but by our observations of others' emotional states. This unconscious social influence becomes particularly powerful during times of uncertainty or stress, when our normal psychological defenses are weakened and we become more dependent on social cues to understand what is happening and how we should respond. In such situations, the behavior of other people becomes a primary source of information about reality, and we may adopt their behaviors even when they seem irrational or harmful. The process of emotional contagion plays a central role in the development of mass psychogenic phenomena, like dancing manias. Emotional contagion refers to the automatic, unconscious mimicking of the emotional expressions and behaviors of others, which then generates similar emotions in the observer. When we see someone experiencing intense emotion, fear, joy, anger, or distress, we automatically begin to mirror their facial expressions, posture, and movements, which in turn creates similar emotional states in our own nervous systems. This mechanism evolved as an important survival tool that allowed our ancestors to rapidly share information about threats and opportunities without the need for conscious communication. If one member of a group spotted a predator and showed signs of fear, others could immediately detect and share that emotional state, preparing them to respond appropriately even before they had consciously processed the nature of the threat. However, the same mechanism that helps groups respond effectively to real dangers can also transmit unfounded fears and irrational behaviors. When someone begins exhibiting symptoms of distress or unusual behavior, others may unconsciously begin to mirror those symptoms, creating a cascade of shared psychological and physical responses that can spread rapidly through a group. The power of emotional contagion is enhanced by several psychological factors that were particularly relevant to the medieval context of the dancing plague. High levels of stress and anxiety make people more susceptible to emotional influence from others. Close social bonds and frequent interaction create more opportunities for emotional transmission. Shared cultural beliefs and expectations provide frameworks that make certain types of collective behavior seem plausible and meaningful. Suggestion and expectation play equally important roles in the development of mass psychogenic phenomena. When people believe that a particular condition or behavior is possible and threatening, they become more likely to experience symptoms themselves. This is not a matter of conscious deception or faking symptoms. Rather, genuine expectation can create real psychological and physical changes that match the expected pattern. The placebo effect in medicine demonstrates how powerful suggestion can be in creating real physiological changes. When patients believe they are receiving an effective treatment, they often experience genuine improvements in their condition, even when the treatment contains no active ingredients. The same psychological mechanisms that create beneficial placebo effects can also generate harmful symptoms when people expect to experience negative effects. In the context of the dancing plague, the medieval belief system included strong expectations about the possibility of supernatural influence on human behavior. People genuinely believed that saints could compel dancing, that demons could possess individuals, and that divine punishment could manifest as physical afflictions. These beliefs created a psychological environment in which compulsive dancing seemed not only possible but inevitable under certain circumstances. The role of social modeling in mass psychogenic phenomena is particularly important for understanding how specific symptoms and behaviors spread through affected groups. When the first person begins exhibiting unusual behavior, they provide a model that others can unconsciously imitate. The specific form that the behavior takes, dancing rather than convulsions, for example, is often determined by the actions of these initial cases. Social modeling is especially powerful when the initial models are individuals who have high social status or credibility within the group. If respected or influential people begin exhibiting certain symptoms, others are more likely to develop similar symptoms themselves. This may help explain why some mass psychogenic illness outbreaks spread rapidly, while others remain limited to a few individuals. The concept of social identity also plays a crucial role in determining who becomes affected during mass psychogenic illness outbreaks. People who strongly identify with the group experiencing the outbreak are more likely to develop symptoms themselves. Conversely, individuals who feel less connected to the group or who have strong alternative identities may be more resistant to psychological contagion. In medieval Strasbourg, social identity would have been largely determined by factors such as neighborhood, occupation, religious affiliation, and family connections. The pattern of how the dancing plague spread through different segments of the population likely reflected these social networks and identity groups, though unfortunately, detailed records of who was affected are not available. The phenomenon of dissociation provides another important piece of the psychological puzzle surrounding dancing manias. Dissociation refers to a temporary alteration in consciousness in which normal awareness and control over one's thoughts, feelings, and actions become disrupted. During dissociative episodes, people may feel as though they are observing their own behavior from outside their bodies, or they may lose memory for events that occurred during the episode. Dissociative states can be triggered by severe stress, trauma, or intense emotional experiences. They can also be induced through various techniques such as repetitive movement, rhythmic breathing, sensory deprivation, or social pressure. Once a dissociative state is achieved, normal behavioral controls may be significantly weakened, making it possible for unconscious impulses or social influences to direct behavior in ways that would not normally occur. The trance-like states reported in many dancing mania outbreaks suggest that dissociation may have been an important component of these phenomena. Dancers who seemed unaware of their surroundings, who couldn't remember their experiences, or who appeared to be responding to internal stimuli rather than external reality, may have been experiencing dissociative episodes triggered by the combination of physical exhaustion, social pressure, and intense emotional stress. The neurobiological basis of these psychological phenomena has become better understood through modern neuroscience research. Brain imaging studies have shown that social and emotional stimuli can create powerful changes in neural activity, particularly in areas related to emotion regulation, social cognition, and behavioral control. Chronic stress can alter brain chemistry in ways that make individuals more susceptible to influence from others and less able to maintain normal behavioral controls. The role of neurotransmitters such as dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine in regulating mood, attention, and social behavior provides a biological foundation for understanding how psychological states can spread between individuals. When one person's emotional state triggers changes in these brain chemicals, those changes can be communicated to others through facial expressions, body language, and other social signals, creating cascading effects that amplify throughout a group. Understanding the psychology of collective behavior also illuminates why certain interventions were effective in ending dancing mania outbreaks while others failed. Approaches that increase social cohesion and shared emotional states, such as providing music and encouraging more dancing, typically made the outbreaks worse by reinforcing the psychological conditions that sustained them. Conversely, interventions that separated affected individuals, reduced social stimulation, and provided alternative frameworks for understanding their experiences were more likely to be successful. The pilgrimage to St. Vitus's shrine may have been effective not because of supernatural intervention, but because it removed dancers from the social environment where their symptoms had developed and provided them with a meaningful narrative for recovery. The psychological insights gained from studying mass psychogenic phenomena have important implications beyond understanding historical curiosities like dancing manias. They reveal fundamental aspects of human nature that remain relevant in contemporary context, where collective behavior continues to shape individual experience in both beneficial and harmful ways. Chapter 5: Cultural and Religious Dimensions. The dancing plague of Strasbourg cannot be fully understood without examining the rich cultural and religious context in which it occurred. The specific form that mass psychogenic illness takes is always shaped by the beliefs, values, and symbolic systems of the society in which it emerges. In 16th century Europe, dancing carried complex cultural meanings that made it a particularly potent vehicle for expressing psychological distress and social tension. Dancing in medieval and early modern Europe existed at the intersection of the sacred and the profane, the acceptable and the forbidden, the joyful and the terrifying. On one hand, dancing was an integral part of religious festivals, seasonal celebrations, and community gatherings. It served important social functions, allowing people to express collective identity, celebrate important occasions, and release tensions through physical movement and shared rhythm. Religious dancing, in particular, had a long and complex history in European Christianity. While some church authorities were suspicious of dancing as potentially leading to moral corruption or pagan practices, others recognized its value as a form of spiritual expression. Certain saints were associated with dancing, and some religious festivals included choreographed movements that were considered forms of worship or devotion. Saint Vitus, who played such a central role in the Strasbourg outbreak, was particularly associated with both sacred and pathological dancing. According to medieval tradition, Saint Vitus had the power to both cure and inflict dancing afflictions. He was invoked by those seeking protection from compulsive dancing, but he was also believed to punish those who violated his festivals or showed him insufficient respect by causing them to dance uncontrollably. This dual nature of Saint Vitus, as both protector and punisher, reflected broader medieval attitudes toward the relationship between divine power and human behavior. The same supernatural forces that could provide blessing and protection could also inflict punishment and suffering. This theological framework made it entirely plausible to medieval minds that a saint might choose to manifest his displeasure through compulsive dancing. The association between dancing and divine punishment had deep roots in Christian tradition. The story of Salome dancing to obtain the head of John the Baptist provided a biblical precedent for viewing dancing as potentially dangerous and morally corrupting. Medieval moralists often warned about the spiritual dangers of dancing, particularly for women, who were seen as more susceptible to the temptations and excesses associated with bodily movement and sensual pleasure. At the same time, the medieval period was characterized by various forms of religious enthusiasm that involved physical movement and altered states of consciousness. Mystical traditions within Christianity included practices such as ecstatic prayer, visionary experiences, and physical manifestations of spiritual intensity. Some saints and religious figures were known for experiencing raptures that involved dramatic physical movements, including forms of sacred dancing. The flagellant movements that swept through Europe during times of crisis, particularly during the Black Death, demonstrated how religious fervor could manifest in collective physical behaviors that resembled the dancing manias. Flagellants would process through towns and cities, whipping themselves in rhythmic patterns while chanting prayers and hymns. These movements combined religious devotion, physical intensity, and collective behavior in ways that shared important features with dancing plagues. The Protestant Reformation, which was gaining momentum in the early 16th century, added another layer of complexity to the religious dimensions of the dancing plague. Protestant reformers criticized many traditional Catholic practices as superstitious or idolatrous, including certain forms of religious ritual that involved physical movement or veneration of saints. This created tensions within communities about which religious practices were legitimate and which were dangerous. Strasbourg itself was experiencing these religious tensions at the time of the dancing plague. While still officially Catholic, the city had significant Protestant sympathies, and reformist preachers were gaining influence among certain segments of the population. This religious uncertainty may have contributed to the psychological stress that made the community more susceptible to mass psychogenic phenomena. The cultural significance of gender in relation to dancing also played an important role in shaping the dancing plague. Medieval European culture had complex and often contradictory attitudes toward women in dancing. Women were expected to be modest and controlled in their physical behavior, yet they were also seen as naturally more emotional and physically expressive than men. Dancing could be viewed as either an appropriate form of feminine expression or as a dangerous loss of the self-control that women were supposed to maintain. The fact that a woman, Frau Troffe, initiated the Strasbourg dancing plague, would have been culturally significant to contemporary observers. Women were often seen as more susceptible to supernatural influence, whether divine or demonic, and their involvement in unusual phenomena was frequently interpreted through gendered assumptions about female nature and spirituality. Medieval medical theory also included gendered explanations for mass hysteria and unusual behavior. The concept of hysteria itself was explicitly linked to the female reproductive system. The word derives from the Greek word for uterus, and was thought to be caused by the movement of the womb within the female body. This medical framework provided ready-made explanations for why women might be particularly susceptible to conditions like dancing mania. The seasonal and calendrical context of the dancing plague also carried important cultural meanings. The outbreak began in July, during the height of summer, when the agricultural cycle demanded intense physical labor and when the heat could create additional stress on both individuals and communities. Summer was also a time of religious festivals and pilgrimage activity, when normal social routines were disrupted and large numbers of people gathered for collective activities. The timing of the plague in relation to the liturgical calendar would have been significant to medieval observers. Different saints' feast days and religious seasons carried specific spiritual meanings and were associated with particular types of divine activity or supernatural phenomena. The fact that the dancing began during the summer festival season may have made it seem more plausible that supernatural forces were involved. Folk beliefs and traditions also shaped how the dancing plague was understood and experienced. European folklore included numerous stories about supernatural entities that could compel dancing, spirits, fairies, demons, and other beings that were believed to have the power to enchant or possess humans and force them to dance until exhaustion or death. These stories provided cultural templates that made compulsive dancing seem like a real and threatening possibility. The legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, which dates to the medieval period, illustrates the cultural resonance of stories about supernatural music and dancing. According to the legend, a mysterious piper used his music to lure the children of Hamelin away from their town, leading them to dance into a mountain where they disappeared forever. While this story was probably based on historical events involving population movement or social conflict, its transformation into a tale about supernatural dancing demonstrates the cultural power of these themes. Seasonal folk practices also included various forms of ritual dancing that were believed to have magical or spiritual effects. Harvest dances, May Day celebrations, and other traditional festivals often involved community-wide dancing that was thought to ensure good crops, ward off evil influences, or celebrate the turning of the seasons. These practices created cultural contexts in which collective dancing was seen as both normal and potentially powerful. The economic and social context of early 16th century Strasbourg also influenced how the dancing plague was understood and experienced. The city was undergoing rapid changes related to the growth of capitalism, the expansion of trade networks, and the emergence of new forms of social organization. These changes created both opportunities and anxieties that may have contributed to the psychological tensions underlying the outbreak. The traditional medieval social order was being challenged by new economic relationships and social mobility. Merchant families were gaining wealth and influence, sometimes surpassing the traditional aristocracy in economic power. Craft guilds were struggling to maintain their monopolistic control over production and trade. Working people were experiencing both new opportunities and new forms of exploitation as labor markets became more fluid and competitive. These economic changes created uncertainties about social status, economic security, and cultural identity that may have generated the psychological stress necessary for mass psychogenic phenomena to develop. When traditional sources of meaning and security are disrupted, people may become more susceptible to collective behaviors that provide alternative forms of identity and belonging. The political context of the Holy Roman Empire in 1518 also contributed to the cultural environment in which the dancing plague occurred. The empire was experiencing significant political instability, with conflicts between the emperor and various princes, tensions between secular and religious authorities, and challenges from emerging nation-states on its borders. These political uncertainties created additional sources of anxiety and social stress. The cultural meaning of illness and healing in medieval Europe provided frameworks for understanding and responding to phenomena like the dancing plague. Medieval medical theory was deeply integrated with religious and philosophical beliefs about the nature of human beings and their relationship to the natural and supernatural worlds. Illness was often seen as having spiritual as well as physical dimensions, requiring treatments that addressed both body and soul. This holistic understanding of health and illness meant that conditions like the dancing plague could be interpreted simultaneously as medical problems requiring physical treatment and as spiritual crises requiring religious intervention. The failure of purely medical approaches to cure the dancers led naturally to increased emphasis on religious solutions, which seemed more appropriate for conditions that transcended the purely physical realm. The cultural significance of pilgrimage in medieval Christianity provided a particularly important framework for understanding and treating the dancing plague. Pilgrimage was seen as a powerful form of spiritual medicine that could cure both physical and spiritual ailments through the combination of physical hardship, spiritual devotion, and divine intervention at sacred sites. The decision to organize a pilgrimage to St. Vitus's shrine represented not just a medical treatment, but a cultural response that drew on deep traditions about the relationship between movement, suffering, and spiritual transformation. Even if the pilgrimage did not cure all the dancers, it provided a meaningful narrative framework that helped the community make sense of their experience and begin the process of recovery. The artistic and literary traditions of medieval Europe also influenced how the dancing plague was understood and remembered. The medieval imagination was populated with stories about supernatural transformations, divine interventions, and the thin boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds. These cultural resources provided vocabularies and narrative structures that helped people interpret and communicate their experiences of unusual phenomena. The documentation of the dancing plague itself reflects these cultural influences. The chroniclers who recorded the events used language and interpretive frameworks drawn from religious, medical, and folkloric traditions. Their accounts were shaped not just by what they observed, but by the cultural categories and explanatory systems available to them for making sense of unprecedented events. Understanding these cultural and religious dimensions helps explain why the dancing plague took the specific form it did in 16th century Strasbourg, and why similar phenomena were common in medieval Europe but are rare in modern contexts. The particular configuration of beliefs, practices, and social conditions in that time and place created a cultural environment in which compulsive dancing represented a meaningful and coherent expression of psychological distress and social tension. Chapter 6: Modern Theories and Explanations. Contemporary scholars and medical researchers have developed sophisticated theories to explain the dancing plague of Strasbourg and similar historical phenomena, drawing on advances in neuroscience, psychology, sociology, and anthropology. These modern explanations don't diminish the reality of what those medieval dancers experienced. Instead, they help us understand the complex interactions between mind, body, and society that can create such extraordinary collective behaviors. The leading scientific explanation for the dancing plague is mass psychogenic illness, also known as conversion disorder or functional neurological disorder when it affects individuals. This framework recognizes that psychological distress can create real, observable physical symptoms that are not caused by underlying organic disease, but are nonetheless genuine medical phenomena that cause real suffering and disability. Mass psychogenic illness occurs when psychological stress and social factors combine to produce physical symptoms that spread through a group via psychological contagion. The symptoms are not imaginary or fake. People experiencing them are genuinely suffering and cannot simply choose to stop their symptoms through willpower alone. However, the underlying cause is psychological and social rather than infectious or toxic. Modern neuroscience has revealed the biological mechanisms through which psychological states can create physical symptoms. The brain's control over bodily functions is far more extensive than was understood in previous centuries, and disruptions in brain function caused by stress, trauma, or other psychological factors can produce a wide range of physical manifestations. The nervous system pathways that control movement are particularly susceptible to psychological influence. The same brain circuits that generate voluntary movement can be disrupted by psychological stress, creating involuntary movements, paralysis, or altered movement patterns. This explains how psychological distress could have generated the compulsive dancing behaviors seen in Strasbourg without requiring any supernatural or purely medical explanations. Research on conversion disorders has shown that these conditions often occur in individuals who have experienced significant psychological trauma or who are under severe stress. The physical symptoms serve as a way for the mind to express psychological distress that cannot be adequately processed or communicated through normal psychological channels. In this sense, the dancing plague may have been a collective expression of trauma and stress that the community was experiencing but could not address directly. The social and economic conditions in early 16th century Strasbourg would have created multiple sources of psychological stress that could have contributed to the development of mass psychogenic illness. Religious upheaval, economic uncertainty, social change, and political instability all created chronic stress that may have made the population more vulnerable to collective psychological phenomena. The role of suggestion in social modeling in mass psychogenic illness helps explain how the dancing plague spread so rapidly through Strasbourg. Once the initial cases of compulsive dancing occurred, they provided a model that others could unconsciously imitate. The cultural framework that made supernatural compulsion seem plausible would have increased the power of suggestion and made more people susceptible to developing similar symptoms. Modern understanding of hypnosis and trance states also provides insights into the dancing plague. The repetitive movement, exhaustion, and intense social attention experienced by the dancers could have induced dissociative states similar to those seen in hypnotic trance. In these altered states of consciousness, normal behavioral controls are weakened, and individuals may engage in behaviors that they would not normally perform. The phenomenon of emotional contagion has been extensively studied in modern psychology and provides a clear mechanism for understanding how the dancing could have spread from person to person. Humans are naturally inclined to mirror the emotions and behaviors of others, particularly during times of stress or uncertainty. This unconscious mimicry can create cascading effects that amplify throughout social groups. Neurobiological research has identified specific brain mechanisms involved in emotional contagion, including mirror neuron systems that automatically activate when we observe others' actions and emotions. These systems evolved to facilitate social cooperation and communication, but they can also transmit distress and unusual behaviors when social conditions favor such transmission. The cultural specificity of mass psychogenic illness symptoms helps explain why dancing was the particular manifestation in medieval Europe, while modern outbreaks more commonly involve symptoms like fainting, nausea, or respiratory problems. The specific form that psychological distress takes is heavily influenced by cultural expectations, social models, and available interpretive frameworks. In a culture where supernatural dancing was a meaningful possibility, compulsive dancing represented a culturally coherent way for psychological distress to manifest. In modern cultures where dancing is primarily associated with recreation and entertainment rather than supernatural forces, psychological distress is more likely to take forms that seem medically plausible, such as symptoms resembling known diseases or toxicological effects. Some researchers have proposed more specific neurological explanations for dancing manias, suggesting that they might have been related to conditions such as Sydenham's chorea, a movement disorder associated with streptococcal infections, or ergot poisoning from contaminated grain. However, these purely medical explanations fail to account for the social patterns of transmission and the cultural specificity of the symptoms. Ergot poisoning, in particular, has been suggested as an explanation for various historical episodes of unusual behavior, including the Salem witch trials. Ergot is a fungus that can grow on rye and other grains, producing alkaloids that can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and other neurological symptoms. However, ergot poisoning typically produces a different pattern of symptoms than those seen in dancing manias, and it would not explain the specific cultural forms that these outbreaks took. The interdisciplinary approach that characterizes modern research on the dancing plague draws on insights from multiple fields to create more comprehensive explanations. Medical anthropologists study how cultural beliefs shape the experience and expression of illness. Social historians examine the economic and political contexts that create stress and social tension. Neuroscientists investigate the biological mechanisms through which psychological states affect physical function. This interdisciplinary perspective recognizes that phenomena like the dancing plague cannot be adequately explained by any single theoretical framework. They represent complex interactions between biological, psychological, social, and cultural factors that must be understood holistically rather than reduced to simple cause and effect relationships. The study of modern mass psychogenic illness outbreaks has provided valuable data for testing and refining theories about historical dancing manias. By observing contemporary outbreaks as they occur, researchers can document the precise mechanisms through which psychological distress transforms into physical symptoms and spreads through social groups. These modern studies have confirmed many of the theoretical predictions about how mass psychogenic illness develops and spreads. They have also revealed the importance of factors such as media coverage, official responses, and cultural interpretations in shaping the course of outbreaks. These insights can be applied retrospectively to understand how similar factors might have influenced the dancing plague and other historical phenomena. The development of effective treatments for mass psychogenic illness has also provided clues about what interventions might have been most helpful during the dancing plague. Modern treatment approaches focus on reducing anxiety, providing reassurance, separating affected individuals from triggering environments, and offering alternative explanations for symptoms that reduce fear and stigma. These principles help explain why some historical interventions, such as the pilgrimage to St. Vitus's shrine, may have been partially effective. While the religious framework was different from modern medical approaches, the pilgrimage provided many of the same therapeutic elements: removal from the triggering environment, social support, meaningful narrative frameworks for understanding the experience, and hope for recovery. The recognition that mass psychogenic illness represents a normal, if unusual, aspect of human psychology has important implications for how we understand historical events like the dancing plague. Rather than viewing these phenomena as primitive superstitions or medical curiosities, we can recognize them as expressions of fundamental aspects of human nature that remain relevant in contemporary contexts. This understanding also highlights the importance of social and cultural factors in health and illness. The dancing plague was not simply a medical event, but a social and cultural phenomenon that reflected the stresses, tensions, and belief systems of its time and place. Modern approaches to public health and emergency response must take these social and cultural dimensions into account to be effective. Chapter 7: Lessons for the Modern World. The dancing plague of Strasbourg, viewed through the lens of modern understanding, offers profound insights that extend far beyond historical curiosity. In our interconnected, rapidly changing world, the psychological and social mechanisms that created that summer of madness in 1518 remain remarkably relevant, manifesting in new forms that reflect contemporary anxieties and cultural frameworks. The fundamental human tendency toward collective behavior that we see in the dancing plague continues to shape our world in both beneficial and problematic ways. Social media platforms have created new environments for the rapid transmission of ideas, emotions, and behaviors that can spread through populations with unprecedented speed. Viral phenomena, moral panics, and collective behaviors that emerge and spread through online networks demonstrate the same basic psychological processes that drove the medieval dancing mania. The term viral itself, now commonly used to describe rapidly spreading online content, reflects an intuitive understanding that information and behaviors can spread through social networks in ways that resemble infectious diseases. Like the dancing plague, these modern phenomena often involve the rapid transmission of behaviors or beliefs that might seem irrational to outside observers, but feel compelling and meaningful to those who participate. Contemporary examples of mass psychogenic illness continue to occur in schools, workplaces, and communities around the world, though they typically involve symptoms that seem medically plausible within our current cultural framework rather than supernatural dancing. Outbreaks of mysterious illnesses that spread through schools or communities often follow patterns remarkably similar to the dancing plague: rapid transmission through social networks, symptoms that are real but don't correspond to identifiable organic diseases, and recovery that occurs when social conditions change rather than through specific medical treatments. The role of stress and social tension in triggering these phenomena remains constant across historical periods. Modern mass psychogenic illness outbreaks often occur during times of institutional stress, economic uncertainty, or social conflict, just as the dancing plague emerged during a period of religious, economic, and political upheaval in Strasbourg. Understanding this pattern can help communities and institutions recognize when they might be vulnerable to such phenomena and take steps to address underlying stressors before they manifest in more dramatic ways. The importance of media coverage and official responses in shaping the course of mass psychogenic phenomena has become even more critical in our information-saturated age. Sensationalized reporting, conspiracy theories, and misinformation can amplify the psychological factors that drive these outbreaks, while calm, factual communication can help contain them. The speed and reach of modern communications make both the beneficial and harmful effects of information management much more powerful than they were in medieval times. The dancing plague also offers important lessons about the relationship between individual and collective psychology. Modern research has confirmed that human consciousness is far more permeable to social influence than we often assume, and that the boundary between individual and group psychology is more fluid than our cultural emphasis on individualism might suggest. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for addressing contemporary challenges that require collective action, such as climate change, public health crises, and social justice issues. The phenomenon of emotional contagion that helps spread the dancing plague operates continuously in our daily lives, though usually in more subtle ways. Our emotions, attitudes, and behaviors are constantly influenced by those around us, both in person and through digital media. Recognizing these influences can help us make more conscious choices about the social environments we create and participate in. The cultural specificity of mass psychogenic illness symptoms also has important implications for contemporary mental health understanding and treatment. Just as the dancing plague reflected the specific beliefs and fears of 16th-century European society, modern psychological distress often takes forms that reflect contemporary anxieties and cultural frameworks. Understanding these cultural dimensions is essential for providing effective mental health care and for addressing collective psychological phenomena. The economic and social disruption caused by the dancing plague mirrors the potential impacts of modern collective behaviors and social movements. While not all collective behaviors are pathological, many represent healthy expressions of social change or community response to challenges. They can still create significant disruption that requires thoughtful management and response. The dancing plague demonstrates the importance of having multiple theoretical frameworks available for understanding unusual phenomena. The medieval reliance on humoral theory and supernatural explanations proved inadequate for addressing the crisis, while more comprehensive approaches that address psychological and social dimensions were more effective. Modern responses to collective psychological phenomena benefit from interdisciplinary approaches that draw on insights from medicine, psychology, sociology, anthropology, and other fields. The role of authority and expertise in managing collective psychological phenomena remains complex and important. The failure of medieval medical and religious authorities to effectively address the dancing plague undermined their credibility and contributed to social instability. Modern experts and institutions face similar challenges when dealing with mass psychological phenomena, and their responses can either enhance or diminish public trust in established institutions. The dancing plague also illustrates the importance of compassionate, non-stigmatizing responses to collective psychological phenomena. The dancers were genuinely suffering, even though their condition was primarily psychological rather than physical in origin. Modern approaches to mass psychogenic illness emphasize the importance of treating affected individuals with dignity and respect while addressing the underlying causes of their distress. The religious and spiritual dimensions of the dancing plague remind us that human beings have deep needs for meaning, purpose, and transcendence that cannot be addressed through purely material or rational approaches. While we may no longer attribute unusual phenomena to supernatural causes, the underlying human needs that religious frameworks attempted to address remain important for psychological and social well-being. The gradual recovery from the dancing plague demonstrates the resilience of human communities and their ability to adapt to and recover from even extraordinary collective psychological crises. This resilience offers hope for addressing contemporary challenges that sometimes seem overwhelming or intractable. Understanding how communities have successfully navigated similar crises in the past can provide insights for addressing present and future challenges. The long-term social and cultural effects of the dancing plague extended far beyond the immediate medical crisis, influencing religious practices, social relationships, and institutional authority for years to come. Similarly, contemporary collective psychological phenomena can have lasting effects that extend beyond their immediate manifestations. Understanding these longer-term impacts is important for developing comprehensive responses that address both immediate symptoms and underlying causes. The dancing plague ultimately demonstrates that human beings are fundamentally social creatures whose individual psychology is deeply embedded in collective relationships and cultural frameworks. This understanding has important implications for how we approach personal and social well-being, education, workplace management, community development, and social policy. The mystery of exactly what triggered the dancing plague in Strasbourg may never be fully solved, but the lessons it offers about human nature, social psychology, and collective behavior remain profoundly relevant. As we face our own contemporary challenges, from social media-driven moral panics to political polarization to global crises that require coordinated responses, the dancing plague reminds us that understanding the social and psychological dimensions of human behavior is just as important as understanding the technical or material aspects of our problems. Chapter 8: The Enduring Mystery. As we reach the end of our journey through the labyrinth of explanations, theories, and insights surrounding the dancing plague of Strasbourg, we find ourselves in a place that is both illuminating and humbling. We know vastly more about the psychological, social, and cultural mechanisms that likely drove those medieval dancers than any contemporary observer could have understood. Yet the ultimate mystery of what triggered that specific outbreak, in that particular place and time, remains tantalizingly beyond our complete comprehension. This enduring mystery is not a failure of modern scholarship or scientific inquiry. Rather, it reflects something fundamental about the nature of complex historical events and human behavior. The dancing plague emerged from a unique confluence of factors that can never be perfectly reconstructed or replicated. The precise combination of individual psychological states, social tensions, cultural beliefs, environmental conditions, and random chance that created the perfect storm for mass psychogenic illness in 1518, Strasbourg was historically specific and unrepeatable. Modern science has provided us with powerful tools for understanding the general mechanisms that make such phenomena possible, but it cannot recreate the exact subjective experiences of people who lived 5 centuries ago in a radically different cultural context. We can understand how emotional contagion works, how stress creates vulnerability to suggestion, how cultural beliefs shape the expression of psychological distress. But we cannot fully know what it felt like to be Frau Troffer on that July morning when she first began to dance, or what thoughts and emotions drove her neighbors to join her in the streets. This limitation is not unique to the study of historical psychological phenomena. It applies to all complex human events that emerge from the intersection of individual consciousness and social dynamics. Even with contemporary mass psychogenic illness outbreaks that researchers can observe directly, there remain aspects of subjective experience that cannot be fully captured by external observation and analysis. The enduring mystery of the dancing plague also reflects the inherent unpredictability of human behavior. particularly when individual psychology intersects with collective dynamics. The same social and psychological conditions that create mass psychogenic illness in one context might result in different outcomes in another, or might produce no unusual phenomena at all. The emergence of collective behaviors like dancing manias involves elements of chance and complexity that make precise prediction or explanation impossible. This unpredictability should not discourage us from studying such phenomena, but it should humble us about the limits of our understanding and prediction capabilities. The dancing plague reminds us that human societies are complex, adaptive systems that can exhibit emergent behaviors that are greater than the sum of their individual components and that cannot be fully reduced to simple causal explanations. The mystery also extends to questions about what the dancing plague meant to those who experienced it. While we can analyze the phenomenon from various external perspectives, medical, psychological, sociological, anthropological, we cannot fully reconstruct the internal meaning that the experience held for the dancers themselves or for their community. The dancing may have served psychological functions that we can identify in general terms, but the specific personal significance it held for individuals remains largely inaccessible to historical inquiry. Some of the dancers who recovered may have experienced their affliction as a form of spiritual trial or transformation. Others might have viewed it as a purely medical condition or as evidence of supernatural intervention. Still others may have had no clear interpretation of their experience at all, viewing it as an inexplicable interruption in their normal lives. These varied subjective meanings were probably as important to the individuals involved as any external analysis could be, yet they remain largely hidden from historical view. The dancing plague also raises profound questions about the relationship between individual agency and collective influence that cannot be definitively answered. To what extent were the dancers exercising conscious choice in their behavior, and to what extent were they driven by forces beyond their control? Modern understanding suggests that the answer is complex. The dancers were probably neither fully autonomous agents nor completely passive victims, but something in between that doesn't fit neatly into our usual categories of voluntary and involuntary behavior. This ambiguity about agency and responsibility has important implications that extend beyond historical analysis. It challenges simplistic notions of individual responsibility and suggests that human behavior always occurs within social and cultural contexts that shape and constrain the choices available to individuals. The dancing plague thus serves as a reminder that understanding human behavior requires attending to both individual psychology and social dynamics, and that neither level of analysis is sufficient by itself. The mystery of the dancing plague also encompasses questions about what lessons we should draw from studying such phenomena. While we have identified various insights and applications that seem relevant to contemporary concerns, there remains uncertainty about which aspects of the historical experience are most important for understanding present challenges and which might be misleading or irrelevant. The danger in studying historical anomalies like dancing plagues is that they can seem to offer simple lessons or clear parallels that actually oversimplify complex contemporary problems. While the psychological and social mechanisms involved in mass psychogenic illness remain constant across historical periods, the specific manifestations and appropriate responses may vary significantly depending on cultural context and technological capabilities. Perhaps the most important lesson from the enduring mystery of the dancing plague is the need for intellectual humility when confronting complex human phenomena. The medieval authorities who tried to explain and treat the outbreak were working with the best knowledge available to them, yet their explanations proved inadequate and their treatments often counterproductive. We should assume that our own understanding, while more sophisticated in many ways, is also incomplete and may be revised by future developments in knowledge and theory. This humility does not mean we should abandon efforts to understand such phenomena, or that all explanations are equally valid. The scientific approaches that have emerged over the past several centuries have clearly provided better tools for understanding and responding to mass psychogenic illness than were available to medieval physicians and religious authorities. However, we should remain open to new insights and prepared to revise our understanding as knowledge advances. The dancing plague ultimately represents one of those historical mysteries that becomes more rather than less mysterious as we learn more about it. Each new theoretical framework we apply reveals additional layers of complexity that were previously invisible. Each comparison with contemporary phenomena highlights both similarities and differences that deepen rather than resolve the fundamental questions about human nature and social behavior that the outbreak raises. This increasing complexity with deeper study is characteristic of truly profound mysteries, those that touch on fundamental aspects of existence that may never be fully comprehensible to human understanding. The dancing plague belongs to this category because it emerges from the intersection of consciousness, society, and culture in ways that reveal the extraordinary complexity and mystery of human existence itself. In this sense, the dancing plague serves as a mirror that reflects back to us the mystery of our own nature as social beings, whose individual consciousness is always embedded in collective relationships and cultural frameworks. The dancers of Strasbourg may have been exhibiting an extreme and unusual manifestation of psychological and social processes that operate in all human communities, but usually in more subtle and less dramatic ways. Closing, reflection, and rest. As we draw our exploration to a close, we find ourselves standing at the intersection of knowledge and mystery, understanding and wonder. The dancing plague of 1518 has revealed itself to be far more than a historical curiosity. It is a window into the deepest questions about human nature, consciousness, and the invisible threads that connect individual minds into the larger tapestry of social existence. We have journeyed through 5 centuries of human thought and discovery, from the medieval explanations of overheated blood and divine punishment to the sophisticated modern understanding of neuroscience and social psychology. We have seen how each era's attempt to understand the dancing plague reflected not just their knowledge but their fears, hopes, and fundamental assumptions about what it means to be human. What emerges from this long investigation is both humbling and inspiring. Humbling because it reveals the limitations of human understanding when confronted with the full complexity of consciousness and society. Inspiring because it demonstrates the remarkable capacity of human curiosity and compassion to continue seeking understanding even in the face of profound mystery. The dancers of Strasbourg, stumbling exhausted through medieval streets to rhythms only they could hear, were our ancestors not just in biological terms, but in psychological and social ones. The same capacity for collective behavior that drove them into those summer streets lives within all of us, usually dormant but always present, ready to emerge under the right conditions of stress, suggestion, and social connection. This is neither a comforting nor a frightening truth, it simply is. The challenge for us, as for every generation, is to understand these deep currents of human nature well enough to channel them toward creation rather than destruction, toward healing rather than harm, toward connection rather than isolation. The mystery of what happened in Strasbourg reminds us that despite all our advances in knowledge and technology, human beings remain fundamentally mysterious to themselves. We are creatures capable of reason and science, yet also susceptible to collective trances and shared delusions. We are individuals with autonomous minds, yet also social beings whose consciousness is shaped by invisible influences from the communities in which we live. Perhaps this mystery is not a problem to be solved but a reality to be embraced. Perhaps the dancing plague teaches us that the most important truths about human existence cannot be fully captured by any single theoretical framework or explained by any complete causal analysis. Perhaps the deepest wisdom lies not in solving the mystery, but in learning to live thoughtfully and compassionately within it. The medieval chroniclers who first recorded the dancing plague could never have imagined that their accounts would still be studied and pondered 5 centuries later. Similarly, we cannot know what future generations will make of our attempts to understand those strange summer months in Strasbourg. But we can hope that our investigations have been carried out with the same mixture of curiosity, humility, and compassion that we would want applied to our own most mysterious and vulnerable moments. The dancers have long since returned to dust, their movements stilled forever. The cobblestone streets where they danced have been paved over, the medieval buildings replaced or renovated beyond recognition. Yet something of their experience lives on in our collective memory and in our ongoing efforts to understand the mysterious ways in which individual consciousness can merge into collective behavior. In our own time of rapid change and social tension, of technological connection and psychological isolation, of unprecedented global challenges requiring collective response, the dancing plague offers both warning and wisdom. It reminds us to pay attention to the stress and anxiety that accumulate in our communities, to respond with compassion rather than judgment when collective behaviors emerge, and to maintain humility about the limits of our understanding when confronted with the full complexity of human nature. Most importantly, it reminds us that we are all connected in ways that extend beyond our individual awareness, that the boundaries between self and other are more permeable than we often realize, and that the health and well-being of individuals cannot be separated from the health and well-being of the communities in which they live. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine those medieval streets returning to quiet after the last dancer finally stopped moving. Picture the exhausted families caring for their recovered loved ones, the community slowly healing from its collective trauma, the gradual return of normal rhythms and routines. In their recovery and resilience, we can find hope for our own ability to navigate the challenges and mysteries that await us. The dance is ended, but the music of human connection and community continues. Rest well in the knowledge that whatever strange rhythms the future may bring, we are not dancing alone. Good night.